What if soldiers declared dead were actually still alive? What if the official report was wrong? What if a soldier listed as killed in action was never actually killed? What if somewhere deep in the jungle long after the war ended, there were still Americans waiting to come home? Most people believe the Vietnam War ended decades ago, but for Michael Mitchell, the war never really ended. Because Michael kept something the Army never expected anyone to keep: a notebook. Inside it were names, dozens of them. Men who had vanished in the jungle, men officially declared dead, men the world had already forgotten. But one day Michael discovered something that changed everything. One of the names in the notebook was wrong. And if one name was wrong, then how many others might be wrong too? This is Book 2, The Names We Leave Behind by Michael Mitchell. Click the link in the description for Book 1, The Names We Carry. Chapter 1. The Call. The house had gone quiet again. Too quiet. Mitchell sat alone at the small wooden kitchen table, the receiver still hanging in his hand long after the line had gone dead. The faint hum of the refrigerator filled the silence, joined only by the steady ticking of the kitchen clock. Outside, the night wind moved softly through the trees, brushing against the house like a whisper. Just minutes earlier, Colonel Harrison's voice had come through the line flat and urgent, dragging Cambodia, Jenkins, and the war back into his life with the force of a wound torn open. Jenkins was missing. American prisoners. The words still hung in the room like a weight that would not settle. Mitchell slowly lowered the receiver back into its cradle and stared at the scarred wooden tabletop in front of him. In the dark kitchen window beyond, his reflection wavered faintly, ghost-like and unfamiliar. Sleep had never come easily since Vietnam, and now there would be no chance of it at all. The war he had only just begun to set behind him had found him again. Not with gunfire, not with helicopter blades hammering the air overhead. With a telephone ringing just after midnight, Mitchell leaned back slightly in his chair, the wood creaking under his weight, and pressed a hand across his mouth as he tried to steady his breathing. Colonel Harrison's words moved through his mind in broken fragments, each one striking with the same cold finality. "He's missing, son. Last seen 3 days ago in Cambodia. They were investigating reports of American POWs still being held." Mitchell shut his eyes. For a moment he could hear the war the way it had always come back. Broken, jagged, unfinished. Helicopter blades, gunfire in the trees, men shouting over the crack of rifles, the day Danny Johnston died. His eyes opened again, but the kitchen remained cold and still around him. Jenkins. Of all people, Jenkins. Mitchell lowered his gaze to the worn kitchen floorboards. He thought about the visit. Jenkins, standing in the garage doorway weeks earlier, lean from farm work, calm on the surface, speaking in half-finished phrases about unfinished business. At the time it had only seemed strange. Now it felt like a warning he should have understood. He should have seen it. He should have heard something in Jenkins's voice. Some shift, some clue, some sign that the war had not released him either. Instead, Jenkins had driven away, and now Colonel Harrison was calling from the Pentagon to say he had vanished into Cambodia on a mission that officially did not exist. Mitchell exhaled slowly through his nose. That kind of mission. He had heard the stories before coming home for good. Quiet rumors traded between men who understood how governments worked when wars became inconvenient. Operations beyond borders, men sent where they were not supposed to be. Things denied in public and buried in paperwork. Cambodia. Laos, places where wars continued in the shadows after everyone else had decided they were over. Mitchell rubbed his forehead, trying to slow the churn of thought in his head. But it did no good. One phrase kept returning above all the others. American POWs. That was the part that tightened something deep in his chest, not just because of what it meant, because of who it made him think of. Danny. Mitchell stared at the table, his jaw tightening. The colonel had not said Danny's name, had not suggested anything so specific. But once the possibility had been spoken aloud, Mitchell could not stop his mind from going there. Men written off, men listed as dead, men left behind in places the government preferred not to discuss. It was impossible. It was also the kind of impossibility war had taught him never to dismiss too quickly. Outside, the wind shifted again. Mitchell looked toward the dark hallway leading to the bedrooms. His parents were asleep down the hall, unaware that the fragile piece of the house had just been split open. He had only just begun to relearn the shape of civilian life there. The careful dinners, the quiet evenings, the measured conversations of people trying not to touch what hurt. And now Fort Bragg, tomorrow. The speed of it settled over him with a dull, familiar pressure. The military had always been good at that, giving a man just enough time to understand that his life was about to change, and never enough time to decide whether he wanted it to. Mitchell sat there for a long moment without moving. Then he pushed back his chair and stood. The kitchen felt colder now. the darkness heavier at the edges. He walked quietly to the bedroom closet and reached to the back of the top shelf, his fingers finding the small metal box he had hidden there months earlier. He carried it back to the table and set it down carefully. Inside were the few things he had never been able to throw away: a faded photograph, a worn notebook. He stared at them for a moment before finally reaching for the notebook. The cover was scuffed from use, its pages softened by time and handling. He opened it and began turning through the old entries, his eyes moving over words written in that strange space between war and homecoming. Letters to Danny, fragments of memory, things he had never known how to say to anyone still living. Mitchell read in silence, the old pages drawing him backward through the months since Oakland, through California, through Pennsylvania, through all the careful steps he had taken trying to become something other than the man who had walked out of Vietnam. And now someone was telling him the past was not finished, that Jenkins had gone back into the jungle, that somewhere in Cambodia there might be American prisoners still breathing behind wire, that the dead might not all be dead. Mitchell stopped reading. The words from the call came back with terrible clarity. They might not be alone. He closed the notebook and rested both hands on the metal box. For several seconds he said nothing, did nothing, simply stood in the stillness of the kitchen with the weight of the decision settling fully into place. He had already given Harrison his answer. He would be at Fort Bragg. But saying the words on the telephone and living inside them were two different things. Mitchell lifted his eyes toward the dark window over the sink. His reflection stared back at him, older than it should have been. He had thought the war would remain behind him if he kept moving forward. Instead, it had only waited for the right moment to call him back. Some men came home from war. Others learned that war never really ended. It only waited in the dark until the phone rang. Chapter 2. Packing the Past. Mitchell did not sleep that night. The phone call from Colonel Harrison had ended less than an hour earlier, but the house felt different now, as if something unseen had shifted in the quiet rooms. The clock on the kitchen wall ticked slowly toward morning, each second sounding louder than the last in the stillness. It was the same restless feeling he remembered from the night before leaving for basic training, when the future waited just beyond dawn. He sat at the kitchen table, staring at the small metal box in front of him. For months he had kept that part of his life sealed away, opening it only a handful of times. Most nights he thought about it, though. Some memories were easier to carry when they stayed locked inside a box rather than loose in his mind. But tonight was different. Mitchell lifted the lid again. Inside were the things that belonged to another life. A photograph rested on top of the stack. 3 soldiers sitting on sandbags somewhere outside Saigon. The edges of the picture had curled with age, but the faces were still clear. Jenkins sat on the left with a cigarette hanging from his mouth and a crooked grin like he was always about to say something smart. Mitchell sat beside him, younger and leaner, an M16 resting across his lap. And Danny Johnston sat in the middle with one arm thrown over both their shoulders, laughing at something that had probably been funny a year earlier. Mitchell stared at Danny's face for a long moment. In the photograph, Danny looked invincible. Most soldiers did in pictures taken before the worst days found them. The notebook lay beneath the photograph. The cover had curled and bent with time, its spine softened from nights of gripping it too tightly. Nights when memory refused to stay buried. Nights when the past came back sharp enough to feel like a fresh wound. At first, the notebook had only been a way to remember the men from his platoon. Then the names started growing. Friends, replacements, men from other units, each name written in careful pencil with the date they died beside it. Mitchell flipped through the pages slowly. Some entries had notes beside them. River patrol, ambush near Chulai, mortar attack. Others had nothing except the name. Danny Johnston. The page sat halfway through the notebook. Mitchell had written the date of the firefight beneath it. He remembered writing it clearly. Rain had been falling that night, soaking through uniforms and gear until everything felt twice as heavy. The platoon had set what they believed was the perfect ambush. But the enemy had outmaneuvered their position. Gunfire erupted from both sides. Smoke rolled through the trees. Chaos swallowed the jungle clearing. Danny had relied on him to cover the flank. But Mitchell hesitated. He still remembered the sound of the rifle as rounds snapped from the chamber. One minute Danny had been laughing, spotting movement in the brush and calling out targets. The next minute he wasn't there anymore. Mitchell never got closure, never got the chance to apologize for the hesitation that still followed him through his thoughts. By the time the platoon pulled back and the helicopters arrived, the survivors were already writing names on casualty lists. Danny's had been one of them. Mitchell closed the notebook. They're all dead, he thought. But the words Jenkins had transmitted echoed in his mind. Mitchell leaned back in the chair and rubbed his face slowly. He had spent months convincing himself the war was finished, building a life that had nothing to do with jungles or firefights or casualty lists, but wars had a way of reaching back. Mitchell stood and walked toward the kitchen window. Outside, the sky was beginning to lighten with the first hint of dawn. A thin layer of frost covered the yard, turning the grass pale in the early morning light. The world looked peaceful. It didn't feel that way. Footsteps sounded quietly behind him. His mother stood in the doorway wearing a robe, her gray hair pulled loosely back. "You're up early," she said softly. Mitchell turned slightly. Couldn't sleep. She studied him for a moment, the way mothers did when they already knew something was wrong. "That phone call earlier," she said. Mitchell hesitated. There had never been a good way to explain the war to people who hadn't lived it. "Yeah." She stepped into the kitchen and poured herself a cup of coffee. "You going somewhere?" Mitchell looked back toward the metal box resting on the table. "Fort Bragg." "When?" "Today." His mother nodded slowly. She didn't ask questions about the war anymore. She had learned long ago that soldiers carried things they didn't always want to explain. Instead, she set the coffee pot back on the counter and looked at him quietly. "You coming back?" Mitchell gave a small shrug. "Plan on it." She walked over and gently squeezed his shoulder. "Just make sure you do." A few minutes later, his father entered the kitchen wearing a flannel shirt and work boots. He noticed the suitcase sitting near the door and then looked toward Mitchell. "Army again?" Mitchell nodded. His father poured coffee into a chipped mug. "Thought you were done with that." "So did I." His father took a slow sip and leaned against the counter. "Something happen?" Mitchell considered explaining everything. The missing team, the possibility of prisoners, the idea that men might still be somewhere out there waiting. But the words did not come easily. "Friend of mine disappeared on a mission," Mitchell said finally. His father nodded. "You going to find him?" "That's the idea." His father studied him for a moment longer. Then he said something simple. "Some men finish wars." Mitchell looked up. His father continued. "Some men get called back to them." Mitchell picked up the suitcase. The metal box remained on the table. He opened it once more. The notebook went into the bag. He hesitated before placing it inside. The names in that notebook had represented men who died in the jungle. Now they might represent something else. Mitchell closed the suitcase. The sun was rising as he stepped outside. Cold morning air filled his lungs. Not long ago, he had walked out of Vietnam believing he would never see the war again. Now he was walking toward it. Somewhere in Cambodia, Jenkins had vanished searching for answers, and the last thing he said was still echoing in Mitchell's mind. "They're not all dead." Mitchell started the car. The road to Fort Bragg stretched south through miles of quiet countryside. Behind him, the house grew smaller in the rearview mirror. Ahead of him waited a war that might not have ended at all. Chapter 3. Fort Bragg. The drive to Fort Bragg took most of the day. Mitchell left before the sun had fully climbed above the trees, the cold morning air still clinging to the roads as he headed south. Frost lingered along the edges of fields and fence lines, the pale light of early morning stretching across the quiet countryside as the miles slowly passed beneath the tires. The rural roads eventually gave way to wider highways, and then to the steady flow of military traffic the closer he came to the base. Olive-drab trucks moved in disciplined columns, their engines rumbling steadily as they followed one another down the road. Fort Bragg appeared on the horizon like a small city built entirely out of order and discipline. Rows of barracks stretched across the landscape. Training fields opened wide between buildings. Convoys of military trucks moved through the roads with quiet, methodical purpose. Mitchell hadn't set foot on a major army installation since leaving Vietnam. The sight stirred something in his chest that felt both familiar and strangely distant at the same time. At the main gate, a military policeman stepped out from the guard shack and motioned for him to stop. Mitchell rolled down the window and handed over the identification Colonel Harrison had instructed him to bring. The guard studied the document for a moment before glancing back at Mitchell. "Purpose of visit?" "I was told to report to Colonel Harrison." The guard's expression shifted slightly, though it was difficult to tell whether it was curiosity or recognition. He handed the ID back. "Building C-12, Intelligence Wing." Mitchell nodded. "Appreciate it." The gate lifted and the car rolled forward onto the base. Fort Bragg felt different from the civilian world Mitchell had been living in. Movement here carried a rhythm that only military installations seemed to possess. Soldiers moved with deliberate purpose between buildings. Trucks followed one another in neat lines along the roads, and helicopters circled slowly overhead like mechanical birds patrolling the sky. Mitchell realized he had never really experienced this side of Army life. He had been drafted, trained, and deployed so quickly that the routine of stateside military life had barely touched him. Looking around now, he understood that installations like this were small cities of their own. Places where soldiers lived, trained, worked, and prepared for wars most civilians would never see. For a brief moment he wondered if leaving the military had been a mistake. He caught himself imagining what it might have been like if he and Danny had passed through a place like this together. Sneaking back after curfew, a pair of MPs catching them and raising hell with command, both of them being busted down in rank for some stupid mistake. A car horn sounded sharply behind him. Mitchell blinked. His car had stopped in the middle of the parking lot. He had drifted off again. The older NCO behind him stepped out of his vehicle just as Mitchell opened his own door. The man walked over with the look of someone who had been inconvenienced more than once in his career. He offered Mitchell a few words of encouragement about blocking the lane before returning to his car. Mitchell nodded politely and moved his vehicle forward. Just like that, he remembered exactly why he had left the army. He parked outside a low concrete building marked only by a small metal sign. C-12. The building didn't look particularly important, which somehow made it feel even more important. Inside, the hallway smelled faintly of paper, coffee, and freshly polished floors. A young corporal sat behind a desk near the entrance typing quietly on a typewriter. Mitchell approached the desk. "I'm here to see Colonel Harrison." The corporal looked up. "Name?" "Mitchell." The corporal scanned a clipboard for a moment and then nodded. "He's expecting you. Second floor, end of the hall." Mitchell thanked him and headed toward the stairs. Each step echoed softly against the concrete walls. At the end of the hallway upstairs, a single door stood closed with a small brass plate mounted beside it. "Colonel R. Harrison." Mitchell knocked once. "Come in." The voice was calm and controlled. Mitchell opened the door. Colonel Harrison stood behind a desk covered with folders and photographs. He was older than Mitchell expected, gray touching the edges of his hair at the temples. His uniform was pressed with the kind of precision that suggested a man who paid attention to details. He studied Mitchell for a moment before speaking. "Mr. Mitchell." Mitchell nodded once. "Colonel?" Harrison gestured toward a chair. "Have a seat." Mitchell sat. For a moment, neither man spoke. Then Harrison slid a photograph across the desk. Mitchell picked it up. The photograph showed a dense jungle valley taken from the air. Thick green canopy covered nearly the entire landscape except for a clearing near the center. Within the clearing stood several structures, fencing, guard towers. Mitchell looked up. "That's Cambodia," Harrison said. Mitchell studied the image again. "How recent?" 3 months. "And you think that's a prison camp?" "We think it might be." Mitchell set the photograph down. "You called me here because Jenkins saw something there." Harrison nodded once. "Yes." He opened a folder and removed several sheets of paper. Sergeant Thomas Jenkins volunteered for a reconnaissance mission under a classified program operating along the Cambodian border. Mitchell leaned forward slightly. "What program?" Colonel Harrison paused. He looked Mitchell up and down. Mitchell immediately sensed the hesitation. Harrison seemed to weigh the decision carefully, as if debating how much a civilian should be allowed to hear. He glanced down at the folder in front of him. Across the top were the words, "Classified." Harrison looked back up at Mitchell and made his decision. Jenkins's team crossed into Cambodian territory searching for evidence of enemy supply routes and possible holding sites for captured personnel. Mitchell frowned. "Captured personnel meaning American soldiers?" "Yes." Mitchell shook his head slightly. "I thought the prisoner exchanges covered that. And why are they in Cambodia? That's a no-go zone." "So did most people." Harrison tapped the photograph on the desk, but intelligence reports have suggested otherwise. Mitchell felt a familiar tension forming in his chest. "You think Americans are there?" "We think it's possible." Mitchell glanced toward the folder in Harrison's hands. "And Jenkins?" Harrison opened another document. His team made contact with something approximately 10 days into the mission. "What kind of contact?" "We don't know exactly." Mitchell waited. Harrison continued. "They transmitted a brief coded report indicating they had located structures matching detention facilities." Mitchell felt his jaw tighten. "And then?" 2 days later, we received one final transmission. Mitchell already knew the words, but hearing them again felt different. "They're not all dead," Mitchell said quietly. Harrison nodded. "Yes." Mitchell rubbed his chin slowly. "And then you lost them?" "Completely." Mitchell leaned back in the chair. "So you want to send another team?" "Yes." "And you want me on it?" Harrison watched him carefully. "Jenkins specifically requested you." Mitchell frowned. "You said that already, but why?" Harrison slid another photograph across the desk. This one was older. A group of soldiers sitting on sandbags somewhere in Vietnam. Mitchell recognized it immediately. He had one just like it in the metal box at home. Jenkins, Danny, and himself. Jenkins believed if anyone could interpret what he found, Harrison said quietly, it would be someone who knew the men who disappeared. "He said you kept a notebook." Mitchell stared at Danny's face in the photograph. The idea settled heavily in his chest. If some soldiers were still alive, men believed to be dead, then the names written in his notebook might not be as final as he had once believed. Mitchell looked back at Harrison. When do we leave? Harrison didn't hesitate. 48 hours. Mitchell nodded slowly. Where are we going? Thailand first. And after that? Harrison met his eyes. Cambodia. For a moment the room felt very quiet. Now he understood why Jenkins had gone back. Mitchell looked at Colonel Harrison. If there are still men out there, men who were thought to be dead. Mitchell stood. I will go back. May I ask who I'm working with? You'll meet the team tonight, Harrison said, extending his hand. Mitchell shook it. Welcome back, Mr. Mitchell. Mitchell left the office and stepped back into the hallway. Through the window at the end of the corridor, he could see helicopters lifting slowly from the airfield in the distance. Not long ago, he had left Vietnam believing the war was behind him. Now he was walking toward it again, and this time the mission wasn't about fighting or answering the call of duty. It was about the men whose names had already been written down as dead, men who might still be alive somewhere behind fencing and guard towers, waiting for a miracle. Mitchell glanced upward for a moment, as if searching for some sign in the sky. No sign came. He allowed himself a small grin. He realized he might have to become that miracle himself. Chapter 4. The Briefing. The room looked like any other military conference room at first glance. A long table, metal folding chairs, a wall map, but the doors were locked from the inside, the windows were covered, and the men inside the room carried the quiet stillness of soldiers who understood that some missions were never meant to be discussed beyond those walls. Mitchell sat near the end of the table. Colonel Harrison stood beside a large map of Southeast Asia, a wooden pointer resting loosely in his hand. 4 men, including Mitchell, filled the chairs around the table. None of them had introduced themselves yet. Mitchell immediately sensed that this was usually how these things worked. Names came later. Trust came even later. Harrison tapped the map. The pointer landed on the thin borderline between Vietnam and Cambodia. This operation will take place here. Mitchell leaned forward slightly. The jungle regions along the Cambodian border were places most Americans never even saw on a map during the war. Officially, the United States fought inside Vietnam. The war was supposed to stay there. But Mitchell remembered the tunnels. He remembered how far they ran underground, how the enemy moved through them unseen. Supply routes stretched across Cambodia. Enemy units crossed the border whenever it suited them. Harrison shifted the pointer deeper into Cambodian territory, approximately 70 miles west of the border. Mitchell studied the map carefully. That's a long way in. Yes, Harrison said calmly. That's intentional. One of the other men in the room spoke up. He was broad-shouldered with a weathered face and a deep scar running across his jaw. You're saying the enemy built a prison camp 70 miles inside Cambodia? Harrison turned toward him. We're saying something resembling a prison camp exists there. The man leaned back slightly in his chair. That's a hell of a place to hide prisoners. That's exactly why someone would choose it. Mitchell remained quiet. Harrison placed several photographs on the table. They were the same reconnaissance images Mitchell had seen earlier in the office, but now there were more of them. Different angles, different lighting, different moments captured from the air. The clearing in the jungle was unmistakable. A fence line, guard towers, 3 long wooden buildings, and what appeared to be a 4th structure surrounded by a second fence. One of the men at the table picked up a photograph. He was younger than the others, lean, with sharp eyes that moved constantly as if measuring everything in the room. Looks like a holding compound, he said. Mitchell spoke for the first time. Could be supply storage. The younger man nodded slightly. Could be. Colonel Harrison folded his hands behind his back. There's another problem, Harrison said quietly. Mitchell looked up. What kind of problem? Harrison hesitated before answering. Some people think Jenkins might not have been the first one to find this. The room went still. You're saying someone already knew? Carter asked. Harrison didn't answer immediately. Let's just say there are a few intelligence reports that were quietly filed away over the years. Filed away? Whitaker said. Harrison met his eyes. No one in the room missed what he meant. They weren't telling us everything. Harrison continued on. Sergeant Jenkins's team reached this area approximately 3 months ago. Mitchell felt the attention in the room shift toward him. Harrison continued. Their mission was reconnaissance only. Observe, document, withdraw. What changed? Mitchell asked. Harrison looked down at the photographs. We believe they observed something unexpected. Mitchell knew what that meant. Prisoners, he said the word quietly. Americans. Harrison did not answer immediately. Finally, he nodded once. That was Jenkins's belief. The man with the scar leaned forward again. And that's when they transmitted the message. Harrison nodded. Yes. Mitchell could still hear the words clearly in his mind. They're not all dead. Harrison moved to another map mounted beside the first. This one showed terrain lines, rivers, and scattered villages spread across the thick jungle. The area surrounding the compound is controlled by multiple hostile factions, Harrison said. North Vietnamese units move through the region regularly, and Khmer Rouge forces have been reported operating in several nearby villages. The younger man let out a soft whistle. So basically everyone out there wants to shoot us. That is a fair assessment. Mitchell studied the terrain carefully. Dense jungle, few roads, plenty of places where a small team could disappear. Extraction? He asked. Helicopter, Harrison replied. Assuming we can secure a landing zone. The scarred man crossed his arms. And if we can't? Harrison looked at him evenly. Then you walk. A quiet silence settled across the table. The mission was starting to take shape. Mitchell could see it clearly. A small team inserted by helicopter near the Cambodian border. Move through jungle for several days. Confirm the existence of the camp. Locate Jenkins' missing team. And if prisoners were really there, bring them home. Harrison reached into a folder and removed another sheet of paper. This mission is classified beyond standard military operations. He looked directly at each man seated around the table. If you are captured, the United States government will deny knowledge of this operation. No one spoke. The younger man finally broke the silence. When do we leave? Tomorrow night, Harrison said. Transport aircraft will move the team to a forward base in Thailand. From there, you will deploy across the Cambodian border. Mitchell glanced around the table. For the first time, he began studying the men he might soon depend on to stay alive. The scarred man noticed. He gave Mitchell a small nod. Name's Carter, he said. Major. Mitchell returned the nod. Mitchell. The younger man leaned forward. Reyes, he said. Sergeant. Another man near the end of the table spoke quietly. Specialist Whitaker, medic. The introductions were brief. That was normal. What rank, Mitchell? Whitaker asked. Mitchell realized every other man in the room had already provided a rank. He no longer had one. He glanced toward Colonel Harrison. Harrison studied the room for a moment before speaking. Mitchell is here at the request of Jenkins. Carter looked directly at Mitchell, confusion visible on his face as he addressed Harrison. Sir? The room went quiet. Everyone seemed to study the moment carefully, weighing every word, every look, every unspoken signal that someone might already be the weak point on the team. Soldiers rarely wasted time on formalities before missions like these. They only needed to know one thing. Who was in charge? Colonel Harrison gathered the photographs slowly, choosing to move the conversation forward rather than answer the question directly. You will receive equipment and final instructions tonight. He paused. Then his attention shifted back toward Mitchell. There is one more thing. Every man in the room looked up. Harrison placed a single photograph in front of Mitchell. This one was different. It showed a blurry figure standing behind a fence. Thin, bearded, wearing what looked like a torn American uniform. Mitchell stared at the image. Where did you get this? Jenkins' team transmitted it during their final report. Mitchell studied the photograph carefully. The man's face was too distant to recognize. But the uniform, the posture, the way he stood slightly forward compared to the others. It looked like a soldier who had been waiting a very long time. Mitchell placed the photograph back on the table. Colonel Harrison met his eyes. Mitchell looked down at the image again, studying it as if it might reveal something hidden. But nothing came to mind. He looked back up. You really think Americans are still alive out there? Harrison didn't project confidence or doubt. He simply said, okay, and moved on. The meeting ended a few minutes later, awkwardly, not exactly the start Mitchell had hoped for. The men rose from the table and began gathering their things. Mitchell lingered for a moment. He looked again at the map of Cambodia. Somewhere in that jungle, Jenkins had disappeared searching for answers. And somewhere out there might be men who had been waiting years to come home. Mitchell slipped his hand into his jacket pocket. He didn't pull it out, but he confirmed the notebook was still there. Now he couldn't stop wondering if the list of names inside it might be wrong. Tomorrow night they would fly toward Cambodia, and if Jenkins had been right, the war might still be holding prisoners. Chapter 5. The Long Flight. Fort Bragg was quiet by the time the team assembled on the airfield. Most of the base had settled into the slower rhythm of nighttime operations, but a small transport aircraft sat waiting near the far edge of the runway with its rear cargo ramp lowered and its engines idling in a steady mechanical hum. Mitchell approached the aircraft carrying a small canvas bag over his shoulder. Major Carter stood near the ramp, speaking with a crew chief while Sergeant Reyes leaned against a stack of equipment crates smoking a cigarette. Doc Whitaker sat on one of the crates checking the contents of a medical kit. The group looked less like a formal military unit and more like a collection of men who had done this kind of work for so long that introductions and formalities had stopped mattering. Carter noticed Mitchell approaching. You're on time, he said. Mitchell gave a small shrug. Figured I'd better be. Reyes flicked the cigarette to the ground and crushed it beneath his boot. "Transport wheels up in 10 minutes, he said. Mitchell looked toward the aircraft. "What are we flying?" "C-130, Carter replied. "Short hop to the west coast, then straight across the Pacific." Mitchell nodded. He had never sat inside a military transport aircraft before, but the smell of aviation fuel drifting across the airfield stirred memories he had not touched in a long time. Reyes grabbed one of the crates and lifted it toward the ramp. "Let's load up." Inside the aircraft, the lighting was dim, and the interior smelled of oil, canvas, and cold metal. Rows of webbed troop seats lined both sides of the cargo hold. Equipment had already been strapped down along the center of the floor. Mitchell found a seat along the wall and secured his bag beneath it. The others settled in around him. Within minutes, the cargo ramp lifted and sealed shut. The engines roared louder as the aircraft began to taxi down the runway. Mitchell felt the vibration travel up through the metal floor as the plane gathered speed. Then the wheels lifted. Fort Bragg disappeared into the darkness below. For a long moment, no one spoke. Flights like this always seemed to carry a strange silence. Men heading toward missions rarely wasted the time filling the air with conversation. Eventually, Reyes leaned forward slightly. "So Mitchell," he said, "you and Jenkins go back a ways." Mitchell nodded. "Vietnam. Same unit?" "1st Infantry Division." Reyes glanced toward Carter. "He's a leg." Both men allowed themselves a faint smirk. "That explains it." Mitchell frowned slightly. "Explains what?" Carter answered calmly. "Honestly, you made us nervous back at the meeting. You didn't give a rank. We weren't sure if you were another boot we'd be hand-holding through the jungle." Mitchell gave a faint smile. "I'm neither." He squinted slightly. "I got lucky the first time around. Pulled Jenkins through a tough spot back in the day. We had to hump it out on foot. Guess you could say I saved his life." The words landed strangely in Mitchell's own ears. Since leaving military service, he had never said them out loud. He realized in that moment that while his hesitation had cost one life, his actions had also preserved another. He wasn't sure what to do with that yet. Something to think about later. Carter looked back at him. "I only met Jenkins once. He kept talking about a Lieutenant Walsh, and what some of the guys coming back were telling him. It was like he knew he needed to go back and exactly what he needed to do." Doc Whitaker closed his medical kit and leaned back against the wall. "You know why he signed up for this one?" he asked. Mitchell shook his head. "No." Whitaker looked toward Carter. The major nodded once. "Jenkins believed the prisoner reports were real," Carter said. Mitchell stared across the cargo hold. "Reports?" Reyes spoke more quietly now. "There have been rumors for years. Patrols disappearing. Pilots shot down in places they weren't supposed to be flying. Some of those men never showed up in prisoner exchanges," Carter added. Mitchell crossed his arms. "I heard stories like that after I came home." Reyes shrugged. "Most people assumed they were just rumors." Whitaker looked down at the metal floor. Jenkins didn't. Mitchell thought about the last time he had seen Jenkins. The words still echoed in his mind about going back to school in Iowa, if anyone came looking for him. At the time, Mitchell had not given it much thought. Now it was clear Jenkins had already made his decision before he ever came to visit. Jenkins had listened quietly that whole night, offering suggestions and advice. That had always been his way. He was the kind of soldier who didn't say much but noticed everything. Mitchell looked around the cargo hold. "And now we're flying halfway across the world to find out if he was still alive." Beyond the missing soldiers, Mitchell wanted to know what had mattered enough for Jenkins to risk going back. The aircraft leveled out, and the roar of the engines settled into a steady background thunder. Hours passed. Some of the men slept. Others sat in silence, staring at the metal walls of the cargo hold. Mitchell reached into his jacket and pulled out his notebook. The letters were worn, but still clear. Reyes noticed. "Friend of yours?" Mitchell nodded. Reyes studied him for a moment. "On the list?" Mitchell understood the question immediately. "Yeah." Reyes didn't say anything else. Most soldiers understood what it meant to carry the dead with them. Mitchell slipped the notebook back into his pocket. Across the cargo hold, Carter had opened a folder containing maps of Southeast Asia. He spread them across a crate and began reviewing terrain lines and coordinates. Mitchell stood and walked over. "Studying the route already?" Carter glanced up. "Always." Mitchell looked down at the map. The border between Vietnam and Cambodia stretched across the paper like an invisible line dividing two wars that had never really been separate. Carter pointed toward a cluster of mountains. "This is where we insert." Mitchell nodded slowly. "Dense jungle. Good cover. Bad for helicopters." Carter gave a slight smile. "That's why we won't be landing directly at the camp." Mitchell grinned. "Yeah, wouldn't that be too easy? Just send in an entire army to recover what rightfully belongs to the United States." For a moment, Mitchell thought about the politics back home. He wondered if any politician's son had ever been sent into a place like this. Then he let the thought go. He couldn't afford to carry that now. He had chosen to come back. No one was sending him to die. This was his decision, and he knew he needed to survive. For Jenkins, for Danny, Mitchell studied the map carefully. So we walk. About 3 days, you think? Mitchell leaned back against the crate. 3 days moving through Cambodian jungle. 7 miles on a base was nothing. 7 miles in enemy territory trying not to get shot could feel like an eternity. Mitchell glanced down at the map again. Somewhere inside that green maze was the compound Harrison had shown them. Fences, guard towers, and possibly men who had been prisoners for years. Mitchell straightened. "You ever been in Cambodia before?" Carter asked. Mitchell shook his head. "No, just a lot of jungle time wishing I could leave." Carter nodded knowingly. "Same here. Strange I'm going back," Mitchell said over the heavy drone of the engines. The aircraft continued west through the night. Below them, the American landscape stretched into darkness and sleep. By the time the first pale light of morning crept through the small windows of the cargo hold, the men aboard the aircraft were already one step closer to the jungle, and to whatever Jenkins had been trying to show them. Chapter 6. Thailand. The C-130 touched down just after sunrise. Mitchell felt the subtle change in the aircraft's engines before the wheels even struck the runway. The steady roar softened into a heavy rumble as the transport slowed and rolled across the long strip of pavement. Most of the men had managed to sleep during the flight, which was good. No one really knew when they would have the chance again. Outside the small windows, the world looked very different from the one they had left behind. Palm trees, low green hills stretching into the distance, humidity already rising from the ground in thick waves of heat. The aircraft taxied toward the far end of the airfield where several other military planes sat parked in loose rows. Helicopters rested nearby, their long rotor blades still, like giant insects waiting for the day's work to begin. Major Carter stood as the cargo ramp began to lower. "Welcome to Thailand," he said. Warm air rushed into the cargo hold as the ramp opened. The heat hit Mitchell immediately. Vietnam had felt like that too. Heavy air that clung to your skin and filled your lungs the moment you stepped outside. Reyes grabbed one of the equipment bags and slung it over his shoulder. "Feels familiar already," he muttered. Whitaker followed behind him carrying the medical kit. Mitchell stepped down the ramp last. For a moment, he simply stood there taking in the sounds. Helicopter rotors turning slowly somewhere in the distance. Men shouting across the runway over the noise of engines. The sharp metallic clatter of tools striking aircraft panels. It was the sound of a forward operating base. Temporary, busy, always preparing for the next mission. A jeep rolled toward them across the tarmac. The driver wore civilian clothes, but carried himself with the posture of someone who had spent years in uniform. The vehicle stopped beside the team and the man stepped out. "You Carter?" he asked. Carter nodded. "That's right." The man extended his hand. "Parker." He didn't offer a rank. Mitchell noticed that immediately. Everyone else had been throwing ranks around since they met. But Parker had only offered a name. Mitchell understood the reason. Sometimes it was easier that way. The less you knew, the less there was to attach to when things went wrong. Carter seemed to understand as well. "CIA?" Carter asked quietly. Parker gave a faint smile. "Something like that." He glanced across the team. "You must be Mitchell." Mitchell nodded. "That's me." He shrugged slightly, almost like a nervous high school kid standing in the wrong classroom. Parker studied him for a moment. "Heard Jenkins requested you specifically." Mitchell didn't respond. He simply nodded once. Instead, he looked past Parker toward the line of helicopters sitting along the edge of the airfield. "Those ours?" Parker followed his gaze. "Some of them." Reyes stepped closer. "Which ones?" Parker pointed toward 3 UH-1 Hueys parked slightly apart from the others. "You'll take one of those to the border tomorrow night." Mitchell felt the old familiarity settle quietly into his chest. Hueys, the workhorses of the war. He had ridden inside dozens of them in Vietnam. The sound of their rotors still lived somewhere deep in the back of his memory. Carter nodded. "Where are we bunking?" Parker gestured toward a row of low wooden buildings near the edge of the base. "Temporary quarters over there. Nothing fancy." "That's fine." Parker climbed back into the jeep. "Briefing tonight at 1800, he said. Then he drove off across the runway. The team carried their gear toward the buildings. Inside, the quarters were simple. Rows of bunks, metal lockers. Ceiling fans turning slowly overhead as they pushed warm air around the room. Whitaker dropped the medical kit onto one of the bunks. "Home sweet home." Reyes sat down on another bunk and stretched his arms. "At least it's quiet." Mitchell set his bag down near the wall. He could already feel the humidity settling into his clothes. Carter opened a locker and began checking the equipment stored inside. "Weapons will be issued tonight," he said. Mitchell nodded. He found himself counting the days since he had last carried a rifle in the field. Strangely, the thought didn't bother him. Some skills never really left a soldier. Reyes leaned back against the bunk. "So, Mitchell," he said, "how long were you in country?" Mitchell sat down across from him. "One tour. We got in plenty of skirmishes. I ended up working point toward the end after." He stopped. His heart jumped suddenly. He had almost said it. He had almost said Danny's name out loud. Mitchell found himself staring into nothing, his thoughts slipping into the same place they always went. Reyes raised an eyebrow. "Hey, Mitchell, you good?" Mitchell didn't respond. He sat there motionless, caught in the familiar loop of memory replaying in his mind. The moment, the hesitation, the moment that cost his best friend his life. Mitchell lowered his eyes to the floor. Whitaker spoke quietly from across the room. "Hey, Mitchell." The calm tone of the medic's voice broke through the fog of memory. Mitchell looked up. Whitaker was watching him carefully. "Jenkins," Whitaker said. "Why did he ask for you? I mean, no offense, but are you even in the military anymore?" Mitchell sat silently for a moment. It was a fair question. He looked back toward Whitaker, trying to find the words. Before he could answer, Whitaker added quietly, "Maybe he thought you'd recognize something." Mitchell considered that. Maybe Jenkins had seen something that reminded him of their time in Vietnam. Maybe he had found evidence that some of the men they believed dead had never actually been killed. Whitaker leaned forward slightly. "You think Jenkins believed otherwise?" Mitchell didn't answer immediately. "I don't know what Jenkins believed," he said. "But I know he wouldn't have sent that message unless he was sure about something." Carter walked over and set a folded map on the table in the center of the room. "Dinner in an hour," he said. Briefing after that. The men settled into the slow rhythm of waiting. Outside, helicopters lifted into the air one by one, their rotors chopping through the thick, humid sky. Mitchell stepped outside the building for some air. The sun was beginning to drop behind the distant hills, casting long shadows across the airfield. For a moment, the place almost looked peaceful. He thought about Jenkins somewhere out there in the jungle, and about the message he had sent before disappearing. "They're not all dead." Mitchell reached into his jacket pocket. The notebook was still there. The list of names waited inside. Men he had watched die. Men he had helped carry out of the jungle. Men whose families believed they would never return. But what if one of those names didn't belong there? Mitchell looked toward the helicopters again. Tomorrow night they would fly toward Cambodia, toward the compound hidden deep inside the jungle, toward whatever Jenkins had discovered before his team vanished. Chapter 7. The Border. Dinner was the usual mess hall fare, a pressed meat patty drowning beneath a ladle of brown gravy, with potatoes and corn piled beside it on a metal tray. The gravy looked closer to latrine runoff than anything meant to be eaten. But Mitchell ate it anyway. He knew it might be the last hot meal for a few days. Or forever. The thought lingered longer than he expected. Forever. He wondered briefly if his mother would be all right. If his father would understand. The image flickered through his mind, then he forced it away. He couldn't think about that now. He had a job to do. The evening meeting was mostly a repetition of information they already knew. Routes of insertion and extraction, alternate landing zones, contingency plans if communications went down, and the call signs for emergency medevac. Major Carter and Sergeant Reyes handled most of the planning. Mitchell listened quietly. He hadn't trained with special operations units and hadn't done serious field work in months. But he knew how to move. He knew what to look for. Strangely, he felt more confident now than he had during his first tour. Perhaps this was what it felt like for soldiers returning for their second or third rotation. Less uncertainty, fewer illusions. The room was quiet except for the faint hum of fluorescent lights. Maps covered the main table, laminated terrain sheets marked with grease pencil lines, river bends circled in red. Coordinates had been written along the margins in tight military script. Ridgelines and suspected trail systems were already plotted. The materials were laid out with the careful precision of men who understood that small details were often the difference between life and death. But the maps were not the only thing in the room. Behind them stood another table, long, stainless steel, clean enough to belong in a surgical ward, except this table held weapons, not a careless pile of rifles and ammunition like an infantry unit might carry. Everything had been arranged in deliberate rows, 4 separate kits, each built for a specific man on the team. 4 roles, 4 ways to fight. A MACV Saugi reconnaissance team rarely moved with more than 4 Americans in the field. Small enough to disappear, large enough to survive contact. Each man carried a specific specialty. At the far end of the table sat the officer's kit. His rifle was an XM-177E2 carbine, the compact variant of the M16 designed for maneuverability in dense jungle terrain. The weapon's 11.5-inch barrel ended in a distinctive moderator meant to tame the violent report of the shortened gas system. Even with the collapsible aluminum stock extended, the weapon remained noticeably shorter than the standard M16A1 carried by most conventional infantry. Empty, it weighed just over 6 pounds. Loaded with a 20-round magazine of 5.56 ammunition, the rifle remained light enough to maneuver through bamboo and elephant grass, yet still accurate beyond 200 meters in capable hands. Beside the rifle sat the rest of the officer's equipment, a chest rig filled with 12 magazines, a PRC-25 field radio handset, signal flares, a carefully folded map case, 2 M67 fragmentation grenades taped for silent carry. The officer wasn't simply another rifle in the line. He carried the team's connection to the outside world. Air support, extraction, artillery. If the radio failed, the mission usually failed with it. Next to that sat the sergeant's loadout. Where the officer carried communication, the sergeant carried firepower. His weapon was heavier, an RPD light machine gun, a Soviet design chambered in 7.62. Captured weapons were often preferred by MAC-VSOG teams for a simple reason: plausible deniability. If compromised across the border in Laos or Cambodia, the brass preferred the enemy to believe the shooting came from somewhere else. The RPD fed from a 100-round drum. Its long barrel and bipod allowed the gunner to dominate a firefight with sustained fire. The weapon weighed close to 16 pounds when loaded, but the trade-off was simple. When the team needed suppressive fire, the sergeant could provide it in a way no rifleman could. A second drum sat beside it, and a third. Firepower was insurance. Then there was the point man's kit. Mitchell studied it carefully, committing every detail to memory. The point man's gear was stripped down compared to the others. His job was to move first, see first, survive first. Weight slowed him down. His weapon was another XM-177 carbine, but the rest of his equipment was minimal. 6 magazines, a suppressed high-standard .22 pistol for silent elimination of sentries, and a pair of smoke grenades for marking emergency extraction zones. The short carbine made movement through tight jungle vegetation easier, where visibility could shrink to less than 10 meters. Most of the time, the point man never fired a shot. His real weapon was awareness. If he did his job correctly, the team never walked into an ambush. The final kit belonged to the medic. At first glance, it looked lighter than the others. It wasn't. His rifle was a full-length M16A1 with a 20-inch barrel, giving the weapon improved velocity and range. The rifle sat beside 8 loaded magazines and a bandolier of additional ammunition, but most of the medic's weight came from the pack. A faded canvas rucksack filled with field dressings, morphine syrettes, plasma expanders, compression bandages, antibiotics, and surgical tools packed with the precision of a battlefield surgeon. The bag weighed close to 20 pounds on its own. Every man on the team hoped they would never need it, but none of them would step into the jungle without it. The 4 weapon systems rested on the table like pieces on a chessboard, each built for a specific role, each man responsible for the others. The meeting ended, and the team returned to their bunks for what rest they could manage. The following day seemed to stretch endlessly. The extra hours allowed time for quiet conversations, map study, and verifying that everyone understood the timeline from insertion to extraction. Mitchell hadn't received special operations training, but he found a strange sense of relief in the simplicity of the team. 4 men, 4 responsibilities. Not an entire platoon. If something went wrong, the fight would be different. Simple. Simple meant a better chance of survival. The sun eventually dipped toward the horizon, and as dusk settled across the jungle, the landscape darkened quickly. Mitchell had forgotten how fast daylight vanished in Southeast Asia. What looked green and open during the day turned into a wall of black shadows once the sun slipped below the tree line. They completed their final checks and said goodbye to Parker, who provided the last pieces of intelligence a field officer could offer. Then the Huey arrived. The helicopter's rotors thundered overhead as it skimmed low across the Cambodian border. Mitchell sat along the open side of the aircraft with one hand gripping the metal frame while hot wind rushed past his face. The scent of jungle vegetation drifted upward through the night air. The sound came back first, that deep chopping rhythm every soldier recognized instantly. Across from him, Sergeant Reyes sat quietly with the machine gun resting across his knees. Major Carter leaned forward near the cockpit, speaking into a headset. Doc Whitaker tightened the straps on his medical pack one last time. The team had been silent since leaving the base in Thailand. Before boarding the Huey, Parker had given them one final warning. "If anything goes wrong out there," he had said calmly, "we were never here." Carter had simply nodded. The helicopter banked slightly west as the pilot followed a narrow river cutting through the jungle canopy below. Mitchell leaned closer to the opening and looked down. The river reflected faint moonlight as it wound through miles of dense forest. No roads, no villages, just jungle. Perfect territory for something to stay hidden. Carter turned from the cockpit and shouted over the engine noise. 10 minutes. Reyes gave a quick nod. Mitchell felt his muscles tighten automatically. The old rhythm returned faster than he expected. Check gear. Check weapon. Check surroundings. The Huey dipped lower. Branches brushed against the landing skids as the pilot guided the helicopter toward a narrow clearing barely visible beneath the trees. Carter shouted again. This is the insertion point. Mitchell grabbed his bag and moved toward the opening. The helicopter touched down lightly in the clearing. The skids barely settled before Carter waved them out. Move! The team jumped down into the darkness. The jungle swallowed the sound of the helicopter almost immediately. Within seconds, the Huey lifted again and vanished into the night sky. The sudden silence felt strange after the pounding roar of the rotors. Mitchell adjusted the strap on his pack and scanned the clearing. It was small, barely large enough for the helicopter to land. Tall jungle trees surrounded them on all sides. Reyes crouched near the edge of the clearing, scanning the darkness. All clear. Carter unfolded a small map beneath the beam of a red-filtered flashlight. We're here, he said quietly. His finger tapped a point beside the river. The compound Jenkins reported is approximately 7 miles west. Whitaker let out a quiet whistle. Hearing the distance and walking it were very different things. Remember, we have 3 days if we move carefully, Carter replied. Let's not hurry and die on day 1. Mitchell looked toward the trees. Jenkins might have stood in this same clearing, seeing the same darkness, wondering if anyone would ever come looking. Jenkins's team came in through here? Mitchell asked. Carter nodded. Roughly the same route. Mitchell studied the jungle carefully. He didn't like the idea of following the same path another team had taken. Early in his first tour, he had learned the importance of changing routes to keep the enemy guessing. But this time they didn't have that luxury. They were following Jenkins. Reyes stood and slung the machine gun over his shoulder. Better get moving. Carter nodded. The team slipped into the jungle single file. Mitchell took point. Reyes followed. Then Carter. Whitaker brought up the rear. The jungle closed around them quickly. Within minutes, the clearing and the helicopter were gone. The ground beneath their boots was damp and uneven. Thick vines hung from branches. Insects buzzed constantly in the darkness. Mitchell moved carefully, letting instinct guide him. Seeing was important, but smell mattered too. Stories of North Vietnamese soldiers detecting Americans by soap, tobacco, or food odors surfaced in his mind. He raised a hand and signaled the team to stop. They had just entered a shallow jungle stream. Mitchell crouched down and scooped mud from the bank, rubbing it across the exposed skin of his face to dull both scent and shine. He rose again. Watch the ground, he reminded himself. Avoid snapping branches. Stay quiet. 3 days. 7 miles. Each step brought them closer to Jenkins. He gave a silent signal and continued forward. The deeper they moved into the jungle, the more familiar it began to feel. Vietnam had been like this too. Endless green, endless shadows, danger hidden behind every tree. After nearly an hour of steady movement, Mitchell suddenly raised his hand. The team stopped instantly. Reyes crouched beside Carter. What is it? Carter whispered. Mitchell pointed toward the ground. Reyes stepped closer. There, faintly visible in the soft soil, were footprints. Old ones, but still clear enough to recognize. Boot prints, American issue. Local fighters usually wore sandals. Mitchell remembered that clearly. How old? Reyes whispered. Mitchell studied the tracks. Couple weeks, maybe. A slow tension rose in Mitchell's chest. Jenkins. Carter nodded. Most likely. Mitchell followed the direction of the prints with his eyes. They continued west, toward the compound. Whitaker glanced around nervously. You think anyone else followed them? Reyes shook his head. Hard to say. Carter stood. Either way, we keep moving. The team pressed deeper into the jungle. Now they had something to follow. The trail wasn't perfect. Rain had erased portions of it. Vegetation had reclaimed others. More than once, Mitchell had to double back, searching for the next sign. They avoided easy paths whenever possible, pushing through thicker jungle to reduce the chance of walking into an ambush. Every so often, another footprint appeared. Another sign that Jenkins's team had passed through this exact stretch of forest. Mitchell felt a strange mix of emotions as he walked. Hope, concern, and something else he couldn't quite name. Jenkins had made it this far, but somewhere ahead the trail would end. And whatever had happened to his team had happened beyond that point. The jungle grew thicker as the night deepened. Carter finally raised his hand for the team to stop. We make camp here, he whispered. Reyes nodded. Good cover. Whitaker dropped his pack beside a fallen log. Mitchell leaned against a tree and scanned the surrounding darkness. The jungle stretched endlessly in every direction. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his notebook. Opening to a blank page, he wrote quietly, Jenkins, we found your trail. I hope the next thing we find is you and your team alive. He closed the notebook and returned it to his pocket. He took a slow breath, his mind filled with all the different ways a man could die in a place like this. 3 days through the jungle. Then they would see what Jenkins had found. Hoping, praying. They're not all dead. Chapter 8. The trail. The jungle never truly slept. Even after the team settled into their temporary camp, the sounds of the forest continued all around them. Insects buzzed high in the dark canopy. Distant animals moved cautiously through the brush, and somewhere far off, a lone bird cried out once before falling silent again. Mitchell leaned against the trunk of a large jungle tree, his rifle resting across his knees. The team had established a small perimeter beneath thick vegetation that helped conceal their position from above. No fires, no lights, only the faint glow of Carter's red lens flashlight flickering occasionally across the ground as he studied the map. Reyes sat several yards away near the edge of the perimeter, watching the darkness beyond the trees. Doc Whitaker rested against a fallen log. Mitchell could tell from the medic's shifting eyes that he wasn't actually asleep. Soldiers rarely slept deeply in the jungle, not if they planned on waking up again. Mitchell looked down at the dirt near his boots. The boot prints they had discovered earlier were still clear in his mind. He tried to consider why Jenkins had come through this particular stretch of jungle. Carter moved quietly beside him. "You thinking the same thing I am?" the major asked. Mitchell nodded slightly. They made it this far, which means whatever happened to them happened somewhere ahead of here. Mitchell glanced into the darkness. Or someone stopped them. Carter didn't answer. The possibility hung silently between them. The jungle swallowed men easily. But teams like Jenkins didn't simply disappear without leaving signs behind. Even careful teams left traces, sometimes for the next group coming through, sometimes for the enemy. Mitchell reached into his pocket and pulled out the notebook. He opened it carefully beneath the dim red light. The familiar pages were worn and creased from months of being carried inside his jacket. Names filled the paper, soldiers he had known, soldiers he had watched fall. Some entries were brief. As Mitchell studied the pages, he noticed something about himself. Whenever his thoughts began to drift, his hand reached for the notebook. He flipped to the page that held Danny Johnston's name. The date was still there in his handwriting. The day Danny died. Mitchell stared at it for a long moment. Reyes approached quietly and crouched beside him. "You keep track of them all?" "Try to." Reyes studied the page. "That's a lot of names." Mitchell closed the notebook slowly. Reyes leaned back against a tree. "Keep me out of that list, would you?" Mitchell nodded once. He slipped the notebook back into his pocket. Right now was not the time to let his mind wander into what if. For months, he had believed the names inside that book represented final endings. Now the mission they were on suggested something different. Maybe not all of those names belonged there. Carter checked his watch. 2 hours until first light, he whispered. Whitaker opened one eye. "You want to move at dawn?" "Sir, we need to establish a sleep rotation. 3 days with no sleep is bad idea." Carter shook his head slightly. "Yes. First 24 hours, no sleep. We sleep tonight." The bird that just dropped us off probably alerted every village in 20 miles that something that shouldn't be here is here. There will be search parties soon enough. I need all eyes right now. He raised his compass and took a quiet azimuth. "We need to move in this direction," he said, pointing west. "If Jenkins followed that trail, it's still our best lead. We just need to go slow, especially in daylight." Mitchell stood and stretched slightly. The jungle air was thick and humid even in the middle of the night. He could feel sweat forming along the back of his neck. Reyes returned from the edge of the perimeter. "Nothing moving out there," he reported. Carter nodded. "Good." They waited quietly until the faint gray light of dawn began filtering through the trees. Morning in the jungle came slowly. First the insects changed their rhythm. Then birds began calling from the upper canopy. Moving during daylight could seem reckless. But in the jungle, sight alone rarely exposed a man. Sound and scent were what made soldiers easy to track, and the constant noise of the forest could cover even the most careless movement. Finally, the sky above the canopy lightened enough for shapes to become visible again. Carter gave a small hand signal. "Move." The team packed their gear quickly and slipped back into the jungle. Mitchell resumed point. Reyes followed. Carter moved behind him. Whitaker remained in the rear. It took time to relocate the trail from the night before. But eventually, Mitchell spotted another faint boot print pressed into damp soil. He crouched beside it. Same tread pattern. Mitchell examined the ground carefully. The print matched the ones they had seen earlier. Carter stood watch while Mitchell studied the soil. "Which direction?" Mitchell pointed west. "Same heading." Carter gestured forward. "Let's keep moving." The team continued deeper into the jungle. Hours passed as they followed the faint trail farther into Cambodian territory. Sometimes the prints disappeared completely, forcing Mitchell to search nearby ground for broken vegetation or disturbed soil. Other times the trail appeared clearly again. As they moved, Mitchell noticed something important. Jenkins's team had been careful. Branches had been pushed aside rather than snapped. Footprints were evenly spaced. Disciplined movement. They had not been running. They had been tracking something. By midday, the jungle had grown even thicker, vines wrapped around trees like coiled rope. Dense undergrowth forced the team to slow their pace. Mitchell suddenly raised his hand again. Everyone stopped instantly. Carter suddenly froze. A narrow washout cut through the jungle floor ahead of them, hidden beneath wet leaves and tangled vines. The drop wasn't deep, but the steep mud walls would turn a simple crossing into a slow, noisy climb. Whitaker studied it in silence. "Can't go around," he whispered. Reyes pointed toward a fallen log stretched across the gap. One by one they crossed carefully, boots gripping the slick bark while the jungle creaked softly around them. Mitchell stepped across last. The delay had only cost them a few minutes, but every minute inside Cambodia felt like borrowed time. Mitchell moved forward carefully. Just as Mitchell stepped off the log, he spotted something metallic beneath a fallen branch. He froze. Vietnam memories of trail booby traps flood his mind. The team all froze, eyeing Mitchell's next move. He crouched and brushed leaves aside, careful to probe around the object. A small piece of equipment lay partially buried in the dirt. A radio battery pack, American military issue. Mitchell carefully checked the surrounding ground to make sure nothing was tied to it or hidden beneath it. Only after confirming it was safe did he lift it. Scratches covered the metal surface. But one detail stood out clearly. A small set of initials carved into the casing, too small to clearly identify. Carter crouched beside him. That confirms it. Mitchell scanned the jungle ahead. If they dropped equipment, something might have happened. Mitchell stood slowly. The jungle around them felt strangely quiet now, as if something unseen might be watching. Carter looked west again. "We keep moving." Mitchell slipped the battery pack into his bag, then brushed dirt back over the disturbed soil to hide the sign they had found. Jenkins and his team had made it this far. Dropping a piece of gear like that was sloppy. The footprints still showed walking, not running. Whatever had caused him to lose the battery had happened suddenly. Mitchell needed to understand why. They moved forward again. Even though instinct told them to stop, Mitchell could feel it. They were getting closer to the place where Jenkins's trail ended. Chapter 9. Broken Silence. The jungle changed as the day wore on. The morning humidity had been thick enough to slow their pace, but by afternoon the air felt even heavier, pressing down through the dense canopy like a damp blanket. Sweat soaked through Mitchell's shirt as the team pushed deeper into Cambodian territory. Mitchell, though beginning to feel the strain of long hours on his feet, kept moving. They had been advancing for hours since discovering the radio battery pack marked with initials. Since then, the jungle had grown quieter. Too quiet. Mitchell noticed it first. He raised a hand slightly. Carter stopped immediately. Reyes froze. Whitaker halted behind them. Mitchell tilted his head slightly. "Listen." He raised his hand to his ear to signal the others. The jungle should have been alive with sound. Birds calling, insects buzzing, small animals moving through brush. Instead, there was almost nothing. Reyes crouched low and scanned the trees. Animals go quiet when something's nearby, he thought. Too many bad situations he'd been in started exactly this way. "Something is out there," he whispered. Carter nodded slowly, raising his hand and placing a finger across his mouth to signal silence. The team spread slightly, lowering themselves into defensive positions among the trees. Each man positioned carefully, creating overlapping fields of fire while scanning for the best cover available. Mitchell studied the surrounding jungle. Tall ferns covered much of the forest floor. The vegetation was thick but leafy, plenty of concealment, but very little real protection if bullets started flying. If someone ambushed them here, suppressive fire would tear through the vegetation easily. Has tactics changed? Mitchell wondered. Has the enemy adapted to no longer care about cover? Minutes passed. Nothing moved. No voices, no footsteps, only the faint rustle of leaves shifting in the warm jungle breeze. Reyes finally relaxed slightly. Could have been nothing. Mitchell wasn't convinced. Maybe. Carter glanced down at the map. We should be within 5 miles of the compound now. Whitaker exhaled slowly. Reyes rose carefully, understanding the unspoken rule that the man who stood first was often the one who drew the first bullets. Thankfully, nothing happened. "Let's keep moving," he whispered to Carter. Carter nodded and signaled Mitchell to move out. The team resumed their slow advance through the jungle. The trail left by Jenkins' team appeared less frequently now. Rain had erased much of the evidence, but every so often another boot print surfaced in the soft soil. Mitchell studied them closely. Jenkins's team had moved with discipline, but something had changed. The spacing between the prints was wider now. Reyes noticed it as well. "Looks like they started moving faster," he whispered. Mitchell nodded. Maybe they were being followed. Whitaker glanced nervously over his shoulder into the trees behind them. Or maybe they found something that made them hurry. Carter pointed ahead. "Either way, we keep the same pace." The team continued west. By early evening, the jungle floor began sloping downward into a shallow valley. A narrow stream cut through the center, its water moving quietly across smooth stones. Mitchell stopped and crouched beside the bank. "Tracks here." Reyes knelt beside him. Several boot prints were clearly visible in the mud near the edge of the stream. More than before, Reyes traced one of the prints with his finger. Jenkins' team definitely crossed here. Carter examined the ground. "How long ago?" Reyes shook his head. "Hard to say. Rains washed some of it away." Whitaker pointed toward the opposite bank. "Look, something small rested near the water's edge." Mitchell crossed the stream carefully and picked it up. A torn piece of fabric. He turned it slowly in his hand. "Green camouflage. American issue." Carter stepped beside him. "Uniform?" Mitchell nodded. "Looks like it." Whitaker crouched nearby and examined the ground. "No blood." Reyes joined them. "Could have snagged on a branch." Whitaker scanned the jungle again. "So we're still on their trail." Carter straightened. "Which means we're getting closer." The team crossed the stream and continued west into the valley. The jungle was an odd place. 1 minute, you could see sea in front of you. The next, the dense jungle swallowed all lights and made seeing extremely difficult. Mitchell slowed suddenly. He crouched low and raised his hand again. The others froze. Mitchell moved forward carefully, pointing toward the ground. The mud beneath a cluster of vines had been disturbed, but not by boots. These prints were different. Reyes stepped closer and spoke quietly. "Bare feet." Whitaker leaned down to study them. "Prisoners?" Mitchell examined the tracks closely. The footprints were narrow, weak. Whoever made them had been walking slowly. "If prisoners passed through here, they didn't come willingly," Reyes said quietly. Mitchell felt a chill move through him despite the heat. Hearing about prisoners was one thing. Seeing evidence of them was something else entirely. Jenkins had reported seeing structures resembling a prison camp. Now they had tracks suggesting prisoners had passed through this valley. Whitaker looked toward Mitchell. "You think these are the guys Jenkins was talking about?" Mitchell didn't answer immediately. Instead, he thought again about Jenkins' last message. "They're not all dead." Mitchell finally nodded. "Maybe." Carter checked the map again. "We set camp before dark." Reyes pointed toward higher ground. "Ridge up there." The team moved carefully toward the slope. From the higher ground, they would be able to watch the valley below. Instinct told Carter the best move would be to observe the area for 24 hours, watch for movement, gather intelligence, learn the rhythm of the terrain. But they didn't have time. Time was working against them. Every hour that passed might mean another prisoner dying somewhere inside the jungle. Waiting wasn't an option. As the sun sank behind the trees, darkness returned quickly. The team settled into another concealed campsite along the ridge. No fire, no lights. Mitchell sat beneath a tree and looked down into the valley. Somewhere beyond that darkness lay the compound Jenkins had discovered, and possibly the men who had left those barefoot tracks. Tomorrow they would move closer, possibly close enough to finally see the compound with their own eyes. And maybe close enough to learn whether Jenkins had been right. Chapter 10. First Sight. Morning came slowly along the ridge. The thick jungle canopy allowed only narrow beams of sunlight to filter through the leaves, turning the valley below into a dim green maze of shifting shadows and tangled vegetation. Mitchell sat with his back pressed against the rough bark of a tree, listening carefully to the distant sounds drifting up from the forest below. They had established a sleep rotation during the night, 2 men awake, 2 resting. No one really slept. Each man closed his eyes when it was his turn, but the stillness never lasted long. Thoughts drifted toward what waited beyond the ridge, toward the unknown shape of the compound somewhere in the jungle below. Birds called intermittently through the dense foliage. From somewhere in the valley came the quiet sound of water sliding across stone as the shallow stream continued its slow path through the forest floor. But beneath those natural sounds there was something else. Mitchell could not hear it clearly yet. Only the faint suggestion of human activity carried upward by the breeze. He looked across the concealed position where the team had spent the night. Carter knelt beside a flat rock studying the map again. It seemed that Carter was always studying the map. Reyes watched the valley through a pair of compact binoculars, while Doc Whitaker sat nearby checking the contents of his medical bag for the 3rd time since sunrise. None of them spoke unless necessary. When they did speak, the words were short and precise. They were too close now for unnecessary conversation. Reyes suddenly lowered the binoculars and turned toward Carter. "I've got something." "What do you see?" Carter whispered. Reyes handed the binoculars over and pointed toward the valley floor. About half a mile west, small clearing. Carter adjusted the lenses and studied the view for several seconds. Mitchell watched the Major's expression carefully. Carter lowered the binoculars. "I think we just found the place." A quiet silence settled across the ridge. Mitchell accepted the binoculars and followed the direction Reyes had indicated. At first, the opening in the trees looked like nothing more than bare earth surrounded by dense jungle. Then details began to take shape. A fence line, wooden posts driven into the ground with strands of wire stretched between them. 2 guard towers rising above the tree line, becoming visible as the first real light of morning spread across the valley. Mitchell realized how close they had come during the night. They could have easily walked straight into the compound's perimeter under cover of darkness. Luck had stopped them when it did. Inside the fence stood several long rectangular buildings. The reconnaissance photographs Colonel Harrison had shown them suddenly felt very real. "That's it," Mitchell said quietly. Reyes nodded. "Matches the pictures. But I thought we had a couple more miles, sir." Whitaker leaned closer, beginning to understand what they were seeing. Carter glanced down at the map again and rechecked his azimuth before confirming their position. The others began to understand why he had spent so much time studying the map. "How many guards?" Whitaker asked, shifting the conversation. Mitchell studied the compound carefully. Figures moved slowly along the inside of the fence. 3 men near the gate, 2 more walking between the buildings. 5 I can see. Carter took the binoculars back. "There will be more we can't see." Mitchell shifted his focus toward the structures themselves. The buildings were simple wooden barracks raised slightly above the ground on short supports. One of them had a smaller fenced enclosure surrounding it, exactly like the photographs Harrison had shown them. Reyes spoke quietly. "That smaller enclosure might be the prisoner area." Mitchell kept watching. A door opened on the far side of the compound. 2 guards stepped outside. Between them walked a thin figure with his hands bound in front of him. Mitchell felt his pulse quicken. The man moved slowly, shoulders sagging beneath exhaustion. Barefoot, his clothes hung loosely from his thin frame. Whitaker leaned closer. "That one of the prisoners?" Mitchell didn't answer immediately. Even without the binoculars, it was obvious. The man's hands were bound. He was being moved against his will. The prisoner lifted his head slightly. For a brief moment, his face turned toward the ridge. The distance was too great to see clearly, but the posture told the story. Exhaustion, hunger, years of it. Mitchell felt an immediate connection to the man below. Under his breath, he said quietly, "They're here." Carter nodded. "That confirms Jenkins' report." Reyes continued scanning the compound. "Any sign of Jenkins or his team?" Mitchell lowered the binoculars. "Nothing yet." Whitaker leaned back against the tree. "So what now?" Carter unfolded the map again. "We observe first." Reyes raised an eyebrow. "That's it?" "For now." Mitchell looked back down toward the compound. The guards had moved the prisoner toward the smaller fenced enclosure. Another figure stood near the door of the building inside that section. Mitchell felt a strange mix of anger and disbelief rise inside him. Men had been sitting inside that jungle prison while the war was winding down and the world moved on. Who knew how long they had been there? Years, perhaps. Families at home believing they were dead. Families burying empty coffins. Names carved into memorial walls. But those men down there were still alive. Reyes spoke quietly. "You think Washington knows about this place?" Carter didn't answer immediately. Then he shook his head. "If they did, we wouldn't be here like this." Mitchell continued watching the compound. More prisoners appeared near the doorway of the smaller building. 3 this time. Thin, barefoot, moving slowly beneath the watch of armed guards. Whitaker leaned forward. "How many do you see?" Mitchell counted carefully. 4 more prisoners. Carter nodded slowly. Reyes exhaled under his breath. Mitchell thought about Jenkins again. Jenkins had risked everything to report what he had seen. And somewhere along the trail behind them, something had happened to him and his team. Mitchell turned toward Carter. "We need to know if Jenkins made it to the camp." Carter nodded. "Tonight we move closer." Reyes allowed himself a small smile, tightening his grip on his weapon as if anticipating the moment it might be needed. Finally, Whitaker looked far less enthusiastic. "And if we get spotted?" Carter folded the map. "Then we adapt." Mitchell looked down toward the valley again. From the ridge, the compound appeared almost quiet. But he knew better. Every prison camp in history looked calm from far enough away. Tonight, they would move closer. Close enough to see the compound clearly. Close enough to learn what happened to Jenkins. Chapter 11. Closer. Mitchell lay flat along the ridge with the binoculars pressed to his eyes. The compound below had begun to change as the daylight faded. Guards moved more frequently along the fence line now, their dark silhouettes shifting between the wooden towers and the gate at the far end of the clearing. Carter lay beside him, studying the same scene. Reyes and Doc Whitaker waited several yards back beneath the cover of the trees, checking their equipment quietly while the 2 men continued their observation. Mitchell adjusted the focus. Inside the compound, the guards had begun lighting lanterns along the inner perimeter of the fence. The soft yellow glow revealed more detail than they had seen during daylight. The fence stood roughly 8 feet high, Wooden posts set firmly into the ground with 2 strands of barbed wire stretched along the top. 2 watchtowers overlooked the clearing. Each tower held a guard armed with what appeared to be an AK rifle. Mitchell lowered the binoculars slightly. 2 towers, both manned. Carter nodded. I see them. The last of the sun was settling along the horizon behind the towers, outlining the structures against the dimming sky. Mitchell raised the binoculars again. The smaller fenced section inside the compound, the area they believed held the prisoners, sat near the center of the clearing. One of the guards unlocked the gate and stepped inside. A moment later, several prisoners were led into the open yard. Whitaker crawled forward slightly. How many? Mitchell counted carefully. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The prisoners stood in a loose cluster near the center of the enclosure. Even from this distance, Mitchell could see how thin they were, their shoulders narrow, their movements slow and deliberate. Years of captivity had carved itself into their posture. Reyes whispered from behind them. American? Mitchell studied their faces through the lenses. The lantern light illuminated just enough detail to confirm what he had already suspected. Their uniforms were long gone. Most wore torn pieces of clothing that had once been military fatigues. But the way they stood told the real story. The way they watched the guards with quiet anger instead of fear. Mitchell lowered the binoculars. They're ours. Whitaker exhaled slowly. Damn. Carter remained calm. Whitaker leaned closer, voice barely audible. If we pull them out, we won't have time to wander around the jungle looking for a ride home. Carter nodded. Extraction point. Reyes quietly unfolded a waterproof map. There's a dry riverbed 2 clicks east. Several ridges give us a way in and keep our tactical advantage. Enough open canopy for a bird if they come in low. Mitchell studied the map. And if the camp goes loud? Whitaker gave a thin smile. Then we run like hell and pray the Hueys beat the patrols there. No one laughed, because everyone knew that was exactly how it would happen. How many guards total? Mitchell scanned the compound again. 7 that I can see right now. Could be more inside the buildings, Carter said. Probably. Reyes moved closer to the ridge. So what's the plan? Carter turned away from the overlook and spread the map across the ground. Reyes, Mitchell, and Whitaker exchanged quick glances as if to say not again, but they gathered around him anyway. The compound sits in a natural clearing, Carter said quietly. Trees surround it on 3 sides. The 4th side slopes down toward the stream we crossed earlier today. Reyes nodded. Good cover along the tree line. Whitaker pointed toward the prisoner enclosure. That's where the prisoners are kept. Carter tapped the map. If we move down this ridge after midnight, we can reach the tree line within 200 yards of the fence. Reyes leaned forward. And then? We observe further. Reyes frowned slightly. That's it? For now. Remember, we got here a day early. Time is back on our side. Mitchell understood Carter's caution. There were 4 of them. The compound held at least 7 guards, possibly more. And the prisoners were likely too weak to move quickly. Charging the camp blindly would be suicide. But Mitchell also understood something else. They couldn't just leave. Not after confirming the prisoners were real. Whitaker gave voice to the thought. Those men down there have been here for years. 24 hours isn't going to change that. Carter nodded. I know. Reyes looked toward the valley again. You think Jenkins made it inside? Mitchell answered quietly. If he did, something went wrong. Reyes nodded slowly. Yeah. Carter folded the map. We move closer tonight, quietly. Whitaker looked uneasy. If the guards spot us. They won't, Carter said firmly. Mitchell turned his attention back toward the compound. The guards had finished moving the prisoners inside the smaller building. 1 lantern remained burning near the doorway. Mitchell raised the binoculars again and focused on the entrance. For several seconds, nothing moved. Then the door opened. A guard stepped outside. Behind him, another prisoner followed slowly. The man stumbled slightly as he stepped into the lantern light. Mitchell froze. Something about the way the prisoner walked felt strangely familiar. The man lifted his head briefly. The lantern light illuminated his face for just a second before the guard shoved him forward. Mitchell felt his chest tighten. He adjusted the binoculars again. Hold on, he whispered. Carter looked over. What is it? Mitchell stared harder at the man's face. The prisoner's beard was thick, his hair longer than any soldier would normally wear. But something about his eyes seemed familiar. A shape, a memory. Mitchell slowly lowered the binoculars. What do you see? Reyes asked. Mitchell hesitated. The thought sounded impossible even inside his own mind. It's probably nothing, he said. Carter studied him carefully. You don't sound convinced. Mitchell looked back toward the compound. The prisoner had disappeared inside the building again. Only the lantern remained. Mitchell shook his head slightly. Could have just been someone who looked familiar. Reyes shrugged. Carter checked his watch. We move in 1 hour. Whitaker began securing his gear. Reyes adjusted the strap on his rifle. Mitchell slipped the binoculars back into his pack, but his thoughts kept returning to the brief glimpse of that prisoner's face. The man had only been visible for a second, just long enough for the lantern light to catch his eyes. Now Mitchell couldn't stop thinking about the prisoner he had just seen, because for one brief second, the man in the compound had looked exactly like the friend whose name Mitchell had written in his notebook on the day Danny Johnston died. Chapter 12. The Fence Line. Midnight settled heavily over the jungle. The moon had climbed above the canopy, casting a faint silver light across the valley below. From the ridge, the compound appeared quieter than it had earlier in the evening, but Mitchell knew better than to mistake quiet for safety. It was a prison camp after all, but after years the guards had likely grown comfortable with their routine, less sensitive to the world beyond the fence. Mitchell adjusted the strap of his rifle and followed Carter down the slope. The team moved slowly and silently through the thick vegetation, stepping carefully around roots and low branches that might betray their presence with a single snap. Reyes led the movement now, guiding them along the narrow path he had scouted earlier. Doc Whitaker brought up the rear. No one spoke. The only sounds were the soft rustle of leaves beneath their boots and the distant murmur of guards inside the compound. They had been moving for nearly 30 minutes when Reyes raised his fist. The team froze instantly. Mitchell crouched beside Carter. Reyes pointed ahead. Through a break in the trees, the compound fence was finally visible. They had reached the outer tree line. Mitchell could now see the barbed wire clearly stretched between the wooden posts. Lanterns flickered along the inside of the perimeter, casting uneven shadows across the clearing. Carter leaned closer to Reyes. "How far?" 200 yards, Reyes whispered. Mitchell lowered himself flat against the ground and slowly raised the binoculars. The compound appeared larger now that they were closer. 2 watchtowers still stood at opposite corners of the fence line. Both guards remained inside them, their rifles resting casually across the wooden rails. Mitchell scanned the rest of the compound. 3 guards walked slowly near the main gate. Another stood near the prisoner enclosure. 7 guards visible again, just as they had counted earlier. Whitaker crawled beside him. "You see the prisoners?" Mitchell adjusted the lenses. The smaller fenced enclosure remained near the center of the compound. The lantern outside the building still burned dimly, but the door was closed. "No movement yet," Mitchell whispered. Carter checked his watch. "Guard rotation soon." Reyes nodded. "Probably every 2 hours." Mitchell kept watching through the binoculars. A guard near the gate stretched and lit a cigarette. Another walked toward one of the towers and spoke briefly with the man above him. Normal routine. Routine meant predictability. Predictability meant opportunity. Whitaker spoke quietly. "You still think Jenkins came this close?" Mitchell lowered the binoculars and glanced around the jungle. If he saw the camp, he had to. Reyes studied the ground near the tree line. "That's where we lost the trail." Carter nodded slowly. "So Jenkins's team made it near the compound. But not inside," Whitaker added. Mitchell considered that. Jenkins had been careful, disciplined. If he got this close to the camp, something must have forced him to stop. Or someone had discovered him. Mitchell raised the binoculars again. The prisoner building remained quiet, but after several minutes, the door suddenly opened. 2 guards stepped outside. Between them walked a prisoner. Mitchell's grip tightened around the binoculars. The man's shoulders were thin beneath his torn shirt. His head hung low as the guards led him toward the edge of the enclosure. Reyes whispered. "That one again?" Mitchell wasn't sure. The lantern light flickered across the man's face as he moved. For a moment, the prisoner lifted his head slightly. Mitchell leaned closer. The man's beard was thick and uneven, his cheeks hollow, but those eyes... Mitchell felt his pulse quicken. The same eyes he thought he had seen earlier from the ridge. Whitaker leaned closer. "You recognize him?" Mitchell hesitated. "I don't know." One of the guards shoved the prisoner forward. The man stumbled but caught himself before falling. The sudden movement revealed something else. Mitchell whispered before he realized he was speaking. "Danny." Reyes looked at him sharply. "What?" Mitchell slowly lowered the binoculars. For a moment, the jungle around them felt strangely unreal. Whitaker glanced back toward the compound. "You're saying that's him?" Mitchell shook his head slightly, disbelief in his voice. I don't know." Carter turned his attention back toward the fence. The prisoner had already been pushed back inside the building. The door slammed shut behind him. Silence returned to the compound. Reyes exhaled quietly. That's not enough to be sure. Mitchell knew he was right, but some things didn't change. Mitchell closed his eyes briefly. He could still see Danny Johnston's name written inside his notebook. Whitaker spoke quietly. "If that really is him," Carter finished the thought, "then we're not leaving without him." Mitchell looked down toward the compound again. The lantern flickered beside the prisoner building. Somewhere behind that door sat the man he had watched die, or someone who looked exactly like him. Either possibility meant the same thing. Jenkins had been right. The war had not ended for everyone. Chapter 13. The Truth in the Dark. The jungle was a hell of a place, Mitchell thought. He lay motionless beneath thick branches at the edge of the tree line, his eyes fixed on the compound fence 200 yards away. The lantern beside the prisoner building flickered weakly in the darkness, its dim glow casting long, shifting shadows across the ground inside the enclosure. For several minutes, no one spoke. Carter watched the guard towers through the binoculars. Reyes scanned the perimeter with his rifle resting against a tree trunk. Doc Whitaker remained low behind them, his attention shifting between the compound and the jungle behind their position. But Mitchell's focus remained locked on the prisoner building. Danny. The name echoed through his mind again and again. He had written it in the notebook himself. Mitchell had seen the bullets himself. He had watched the moment unfold, the split second when his hesitation cost a life. He remembered the chaos swallowing the clearing as the platoon pulled back under fire. Mitchell exhaled slowly. Carter noticed. "You all right?" the major whispered. Mitchell nodded once, thinking. "About your friend." Mitchell didn't answer, but Carter didn't need confirmation. The major now fully understood why Jenkins had named Mitchell as the one who needed to come on this mission. Colonel Harrison had understood it too. Reyes crawled closer. Mitchell spoke quietly. "Danny was killed about halfway through our tour. I saw the soldier coming on our flank and I hesitated." Reyes raised an eyebrow. "Hesitated?" Mitchell nodded. "I hadn't been that close to an enemy before. I could see his face, see that he was real, just like you and me, only he pulled the trigger first." Whitaker leaned forward slightly. "Did you get the dog tags?" he asked. Mitchell looked at Whitaker, confused by the question. Whitaker continued before Mitchell could respond. "The Army gives us 2 dog tags. One stays with the body, and the other gets taken for records and processing. Once the Army processes the body, the tags get passed on to family or friends." Mitchell paused for a moment. He thought about what might have happened to Danny's dog tags. He had assumed they were shipped home, but Lieutenant Walsh had known how close they were. Mitchell had wanted to tell the family himself. Standard procedure, he thought. Surely the tags had been sent home, but something inside him already knew the answer. Carter shifted slightly closer. "Let's assume for a moment you're right," he said calmly. "That means one of the prisoners in that compound is Danny Johnston." Reyes glanced back toward the compound. "Which means the camp has been holding Americans," Whitaker added quietly. "And Jenkins found it." Mitchell studied the compound again. He wondered how Jenkins had discovered the place. Then, almost instantly, the pieces began to fall together. Mitchell leaned toward Carter. "Jenkins came to visit me a few months before Harrison called. Told me that if anyone came looking for him, he'd be going back to Iowa to start school." Mitchell paused. "I thought that was strange when he said it, but now I understand." Reyes listened closely. Mitchell continued. "He'd been trying to get me to work with our old lieutenant. Lieutenant Walsh was helping veterans who had come back from overseas. Jenkins told me I wouldn't believe some of the stories those men were telling." Mitchell glanced back toward the compound. "I wonder if any of those veterans had been prisoners here." Whitaker spoke quietly. "If that's true, that would explain why Jenkins came back." Mitchell nodded. "To free the ones still in captivity." Reyes looked toward the prisoner building. "Which means Jenkins might still be here somewhere too." The idea settled heavily over the group. If Jenkins had gotten close enough to confirm the prisoners, he might have tried to get inside the camp. Or worse, the guards might have captured him. Carter unfolded the map again. "Our original orders were reconnaissance only." Reyes frowned. "Original orders?" Carter met his eyes. "That was before we confirmed prisoners." Whitaker said quietly what everyone was already thinking. "We can't leave them here." Carter didn't answer immediately. Mitchell looked back toward the compound. He wondered if Jenkins had stood in the same jungle and faced the same decision. Another guard walked slowly along the fence line. The lantern illuminated the man's face and the glowing red tip of his cigarette. The prisoners inside had likely believed the war ended years ago. Believed the world had forgotten them. Time probably held little meaning anymore. The 4 men remained silent for a long moment as they continued observing the camp. Reyes finally broke the silence. "How many guards do we have again?" Mitchell answered automatically. 7 visible. 2 towers, 3 near the gate, 1 patrolling the fence, 1 watching the prisoner enclosure. Carter nodded. "And probably at least 2 more inside the barracks." Whitaker looked uneasy. "That's still a lot for 4 men. Reyes allowed himself a faint grin. "We're not exactly walking through the front gate." Mitchell looked back toward the ridge they had descended earlier. "Terrain favors us." Carter nodded. "The tree line gives us cover," Reyes added quietly. "And the guards don't look like they expect trouble." Whitaker glanced nervously toward the towers. They might if they hear gunfire. Carter closed the map. That's why we don't start with gunfire. Mitchell felt the shift in the conversation. This was no longer reconnaissance. They were planning something else now, something far more dangerous. Carter leaned closer. First priority is confirming prisoner count. Second is determining if Jenkins is here. And third, Reyes finished the sentence, getting them out. Whitaker looked at Mitchell. You ready for that? Mitchell stared down at the compound again. The lantern outside the prisoner building flickered weakly. Behind that door might be the man he had written countless letters to. Mitchell nodded. I didn't come all this way to leave any of them here. Reyes smiled faintly. Good answer. Carter checked his watch. Guard shift should change within the next 30 minutes. Mitchell raised an eyebrow. You thinking infiltration? Observation first, Carter said quietly. Remember, we are a day early, and our extraction has to have perfect timing. We might need additional time to get out, but if we move too soon, we could be exposed with men who may not understand what's happening. That would allow the other side to track us and hunt us down. He paused. Timing is critical if we're going off mission. Then he added quietly, but if we find an opening, he let the sentence hang unfinished. Mitchell understood. They would wait for the right moment, because somewhere inside that compound, Danny Johnston might still be alive. And if he was, Mitchell intended to bring him home. A faint breeze moved through the trees. Inside the prisoner building, a shadow passed briefly across the window. Mitchell's grip tightened around his rifle. All the letters he had written. Tonight, he might get the chance to erase them. Chapter 14. The Opening. The jungle held its breath. Morning arrived the way it always did in Southeast Asia, slowly, almost cautiously. At first, only thin blades of light slipped through the dense canopy, falling across the forest floor like narrow spotlights on a dark stage. Gradually, the sun climbed higher, pushing pale gold through layers of leaves until the jungle below began to wake. Birds called across the trees. Insects returned to their steady chorus. The forest, quiet through the night, erupted again with the restless noise of life beginning another day. Below them, the compound followed its same predictable rhythm. Guard rotations. Prisoners occasionally brought outside. Nothing changed. The heat grew steadily worse as the day stretched on. Humidity pressed down through the canopy until the air felt thick enough to breathe in slow, heavy pulls. The men had been lying in position for nearly 18 hours when nature finally called. It was inevitable. Every special operations soldier understood that sooner or later it would happen. Some moments offered easier opportunities than others. Today offered none. Reyes went first, leaning away from the group and muttering a quiet apology before relieving himself as far from the others as the brush allowed. Whitaker followed soon after. But as the medic finished, a silent but deadly burst of air escaped him. Sharp and foul, like something rotten buried beneath the jungle floor. The smell spread quickly, like a skunk had taken refuge somewhere inside him. None of the men spoke. The team had been rationing water carefully, and dehydration made the scent of urine strong and acrid. The odor lingered in the humid air as the sun climbed higher, baking the ground beneath them. Eventually it faded. As evening approached and the sun began dropping behind the western tree line, Carter gathered the team quietly and reviewed the plan once more. Each man had a job. If even one of them failed, the mission could collapse instantly. There was little margin for error. Mitchell lay flat against the damp earth near the tree line, watching the prison compound through the binoculars. The lantern outside the prisoner building still burned, its flame swaying gently whenever the night wind drifted across the clearing. The lantern was the life of the camp. Each evening it was lit, each morning it was extinguished. The same routine. Every day, they finalized the details. Carter checked his watch. 5 minutes, he whispered. The guard shift Carter had predicted was about to begin. From their concealed position beneath the trees, they had been studying the routine carefully for nearly an hour. The pattern had already repeated twice. One guard left the tower. Another replaced him. 2 guards rotated positions near the gate. During those brief minutes, the rest of the compound grew distracted. That was the opening Carter intended to use. Mitchell handed the binoculars to Reyes. You see him again? Reyes scanned the compound slowly. No prisoners outside right now. Mitchell nodded. The door to the prisoner building remained closed. Whitaker crawled forward slightly. Still thinking about him? Mitchell didn't answer immediately. The possibility that his friend had been alive all that time weighed heavily in his chest. Mitchell had buried that memory months ago, but tonight it refused to stay buried. Carter spoke quietly. Movement. All 4 men turned their attention back toward the compound. One of the guards in the nearest watchtower climbed down the ladder. Another guard crossed the clearing toward the tower to replace him. At the same time, 2 guards near the gate began exchanging positions. Exactly the routine Carter had been waiting for. Reyes lowered the binoculars. "That's the window." Carter nodded. "Mitchell, Reyes, you're with me." Whitaker looked up. "What about me?" "You stay here," Carter said. Whitaker frowned. "I'm the medic." "And we'll need you if this turns loud." Carter replied calmly. "Provide overwatch. You fire if we're in danger of being killed by an unknown enemy." Whitaker didn't like it, but he nodded. Mitchell checked the chamber of his rifle. Reyes adjusted the knife strapped to his vest. Carter gave a small hand signal. Slow and quiet. The three men slipped forward through the jungle. Every step required patience. Roots twisted across the ground. Low branches threatened to snap beneath careless movement. Mitchell moved deliberately, placing each boot where the soil felt solid and quiet beneath the weight. The fence slowly grew closer. 200 yards became 100, then 50. They stopped behind a dense cluster of ferns. The fence now stood only 20 yards away. Mitchell could clearly see the rough wooden posts and the strands of barbed wire stretched between them. Beyond the fence, the compound yard remained quiet. The guards were still focused on the shift change. Carter crouched beside Mitchell. "Reyes, check the left." Reyes slipped along the tree line until the jungle nearly touched the fence. He moved with calm precision. This was not his first rodeo. He studied the ground carefully, then returned. "There's a section where the wire dips slightly." Mitchell followed Carter as they moved toward the spot Reyes had found. The barbed wire sagged just enough to create a narrow opening near the bottom. Probably years of weather, or possibly someone forcing their way through earlier. Mitchell's mind immediately jumped to Jenkins. Carter knelt beside the fence and examined the wire. "No alarms," he whispered. Reyes gave a faint grin. "Lazy guards." Carter pulled a small pair of wire cutters from his pack. He worked carefully along one section of the fence. The metal strands separated with a faint snap. Mitchell froze. The nearest guard stood barely 30 yards away, but the man never turned toward the trees. After a moment, Carter finished widening the gap. "Enough room," he whispered. Reyes slid through first. Mitchell followed close behind. For the first time, they stood inside the compound perimeter. Mitchell felt the weight of that realization immediately. They were standing in the same clearing where American prisoners had been held. Carter pointed toward the prisoner building. "Straight there." The three men moved quickly but silently across the clearing. The lantern light created deep shadows across the ground, giving them brief pockets of darkness to move through. Mitchell kept his eyes locked on the guards near the gate. None of them looked their direction. The lantern outside the prisoner building flickered softly as they approached. Reyes reached the door first. He pressed his ear against the wood and listened. Mitchell stepped beside him. From inside the building came faint sounds. Movement, quiet voices, American voices. Mitchell felt a sudden surge of emotion he hadn't expected. Reyes glanced at Carter. "About 6 or 7 inside." Carter nodded. "Quiet entry." Reyes slowly pushed the door open. The hinges creaked slightly. Inside the building, several thin figures sat or lay along the wooden floor. The prisoners turned their heads toward the doorway. For a moment, confusion filled their faces. Then recognition. One of them whispered hoarsely, "Americans." Mitchell stepped inside. The air smelled of damp wood, sweat, and long confinement. The prisoners looked older than they should have. Years of captivity had carved deep lines into their faces. Mitchell counted quickly. 6 men, all alive. One of them slowly stood. The lantern light from outside fell across his face. Mitchell felt his breath catch. The man stared at him with tired but alert eyes. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then the prisoner whispered quietly, "Mitchell?" Only one man had ever spoken his name in exactly that tone. "Danny," Mitchell said. Daniel Johnston stood frozen in the dim lantern light. Captivity showed in every line of his face, but the recognition in his eyes was unmistakable. Mitchell stepped forward, standing face to face with the friend he believed had died in the jungle, and Danny Johnston was still alive. Chapter 15. The Living Dead. For several seconds, neither man moved. Mitchell stood inside the dim prisoner building, staring at Daniel Johnston as if time itself had stopped. The lantern outside the doorway cast just enough light through the rough wooden slats to illuminate Danny's face in shifting bands of yellow and shadow. Danny blinked slowly, as if his mind struggled to accept what he was seeing. "Mitchell?" he whispered again. Mitchell felt the weight of the moment settle heavily in his chest. "It's me," he said quietly. Danny took a slow step forward. His movements were stiff, the careful, uncertain steps of a man whose body had forgotten what normal strength felt like. You're really here?" Mitchell nodded. "Yeah." For a moment, Danny looked almost amused in disbelief. "Thought I was hallucinating again." Reyes stepped quietly inside the doorway behind Mitchell. "You two know each other?" Mitchell didn't take his eyes off Danny. Danny glanced at Reyes and then at Carter. "You guys with him?" Carter gave a small nod. One of the other prisoners pushed himself upright against the wall. You mean America knows we're here? Whitaker's voice came faintly through the doorway behind them. Working on it, the prisoners looked at each other with a mixture of shock and cautious hope. Mitchell turned back toward Danny. What happened to you? Danny leaned against the wall as if the effort of standing had already drained what little strength remained in his legs. That firefight, he said quietly. Danny rubbed his beard slowly, fingers moving through the thick, uneven growth. The bullet knocked me out. When I woke up, I was tied to a truck. Private Miles said they overran our position, forced you all back. They took the bodies and switched everyone's dog tags. Mitchell felt his jaw tighten. Switch dog tags, North Vietnamese? Danny shook his head slowly. Not regular army. Some kind of mixed group. Vietnamese and Khmer fighters working together. Danny paused, the memory clearly heavy. When we got to the first camp, I fought infection. Had a fever so bad I thought that would finish me. But the rifle round went clean through. He lifted the ragged edge of his shirt. The lantern light revealed the scarred entry and exit wounds across his side, the skin around them discolored from what had once been a severe infection. By some miracle, Danny said quietly. I'm still here. Carter spoke softly from near the door. They moved you across the border. Danny nodded. Couple days after the firefight, everyone wearing different dog tags. Reyes frowned slightly. Families of soldiers told their loved ones were dead, Reyes said quietly, when they could actually be alive. How long have you been here? Carter asked. Danny gave a weak shrug. Lost count after a while. Mitchell glanced around the room again. 6 prisoners, all thin, all worn down by time. One of them spoke quietly from the far wall. They move prisoners between camps sometimes, but most of us been here a little while. Mitchell crouched beside Danny. Did you see Jenkins? Danny looked confused. Jenkins? Sergeant Thomas Jenkins. Danny's expression shifted slightly. Tall guy? Quiet? He paused. Wait, are Thomas Jenkins from 1st Infantry Division? Mitchell nodded. Danny looked toward the door for a moment as if trying to piece the memory together. Yeah. Mitchell leaned closer. He came here? Danny nodded slowly. Couple weeks ago. Reyes stepped forward. What happened to him? Danny hesitated. Mitchell noticed the change immediately. Danny? Danny lowered his voice. They caught him. The words hung heavily in the room. Carter's tone sharpened. Inside the camp? No, Danny said quietly. Outside the fence. Mitchell felt his stomach tighten. What did they do with him? Danny's eyes shifted toward the far end of the compound beyond the walls. There's another building, he said softly. Smaller one, behind the barracks. Mitchell remembered seeing something like that earlier from the ridge. The extra fenced section. What's inside it? Carter asked. Danny answered quietly. Interrogation, Reyes muttered under his breath. Damn. Mitchell felt anger rising slowly in his chest. Jenkins had come all this way trying to confirm the truth, and the guards had taken him before he could get out. Is he still alive? Mitchell asked. Danny nodded. Last time I saw him. Carter looked toward Reyes. Then he's coming with us too. Before we start planning a jailbreak, we should talk about how we're getting 6 prisoners out of here. Mitchell glanced around the room again. The men looked exhausted. Weak. Walking through the jungle would be hard enough for trained soldiers. For prisoners who had endured years of captivity, it would be nearly impossible without help. Danny read the concern in Mitchell's expression. We can move, he said quietly. Mitchell studied him carefully. You sure about that? Danny gave a faint smile. Been waiting for someone to show up. He looked around at the others. You think we're going to stay behind now? Reyes chuckled quietly. I like this guy. Carter checked his watch again. We don't have much time before the next guard patrol. Mitchell, I hate to break up the reunion, but it's time to move. Mitchell nodded and turned back toward the prisoners. We're getting you out of here tonight. The men inside the building looked at each other. For some of them, years had passed surviving on nothing but hope. Now that hope stood in front of them wearing American uniforms. Danny looked back at Mitchell. Good to see you again, he said quietly. Same here. Outside, the lantern still flickered beside the door. Mitchell glanced toward the far end of the camp. They had come here searching for answers. Now they had something far more dangerous. A rescue mission. Chapter 16. The other building. Mitchell stood just inside the doorway, watching the clearing beyond the fence through the narrow opening. Guards continued moving through their routine positions, unaware that 3 American soldiers and 6 prisoners were now only a few yards away from them. Behind Mitchell, Carter crouched beside the wall studying the layout of the compound through the thin gaps between the weathered wooden boards. Reyes stood near the doorway with his rifle ready. The 6 prisoners waited quietly along the walls. Danny Johnston leaned against a rough support beam, breathing slowly and carefully, conserving what little strength he had left. Mitchell turned back toward him. "You said Jenkins is in another building." Danny nodded. "Yeah." He lifted his arm and pointed toward the far end of the compound. "Behind the main barracks, smaller structure. Guards keep it locked most of the time." Carter moved closer. "How many guards?" Danny thought for a moment. "Usually 2 during the day, sometimes just 1 at night." Reyes glanced toward the door. "And right now?" Danny shook his head. "Hard to say." Mitchell stepped carefully toward the doorway and looked out again. From this angle, he could see the larger barracks building standing near the center of the compound. Behind it, partially hidden in darkness, stood another smaller structure, exactly where Danny had pointed. A single lantern burned outside its entrance, casting a weak halo of yellow light over the doorway. Mitchell turned back toward Carter. "How many of you can walk?" One of the older prisoners spoke first. "Most of us." Another man lifted his arm slowly. "Not fast, but we'll manage." Mitchell studied them carefully. Captivity had made them weak, but determination still showed in their eyes. Danny noticed Mitchell watching them. "We've been waiting a long time for this," he said quietly. Mitchell nodded. "Then we're not wasting it." Carter made his decision quickly. "Reyes, you stay here with the prisoners." Reyes frowned. "I want in on this." Carter shook his head. "If something goes wrong, they'll need someone who can get them out." Reyes understood the logic immediately. He gave a reluctant nod. Carter looked toward Mitchell. "You and me." Mitchell didn't hesitate. Jenkins had found Danny. Now it was his turn to find Jenkins. "Let's go." Danny stepped forward slightly. "Careful," he said quietly. "Guards check that building often." Mitchell met his eyes. "We'll bring him back." Danny nodded once. Mitchell slipped out of the doorway and crouched low in the shadows along the side of the building. Carter followed close behind. The compound clearing stretched silently around them. Lantern light flickered across packed dirt and scattered patches of trampled grass. The nearest guard stood near the gate with his back turned. Another guard moved slowly along the fence line. The watchtower above remained occupied. Mitchell and Carter crossed the open ground carefully, keeping close to the long shadows cast by the barracks walls. They reached the rear wall of the main building and paused. From here, the smaller structure stood only 20 yards away. Mitchell could see the door clearly now. A guard sat on a wooden chair outside it. His rifle rested across his lap. The man's head drooped slightly, half asleep. Carter leaned close to Mitchell. "One guard." Mitchell nodded. "Lucky." Carter quietly drew the small combat knife from his belt. Quiet. Mitchell understood. Silence was their only advantage. They waited. The guard shifted in his chair, then leaned back again. His eyes closed briefly. Carter moved. He crossed the distance in seconds. Mitchell followed close behind. The guard's eyes opened just as Carter's hand clamped tightly across his mouth. The knife moved quickly. The struggle lasted only a moment. Then the guard slumped forward silently. Mitchell dragged the body behind the building while Carter checked the door. Locked. Carter pulled a small tool from his vest and worked quickly at the latch. Within seconds, the lock clicked open. Mitchell positioned himself beside the door. Carter nodded once, then pushed it open slowly. The room inside smelled of damp wood, sweat, and old blood. A single lantern burned near the far wall, its flame wavering slightly in the still air. Chains hung from iron hooks fixed into the wooden beams overhead. And in the center of the room sat a man tied to a wooden chair. His head hung forward. Blood stained the front of his shirt. Mitchell stepped inside carefully. The man lifted his head slowly. Even through bruises and exhaustion, Mitchell recognized him instantly. Jenkins. Jenkins squinted at them through swollen eyes. For a moment, confusion crossed his face, then recognition. "You took your time," he muttered hoarsely. Mitchell almost laughed. "Good to see you too." Carter quickly cut the ropes binding Jenkins to the chair. The sergeant nearly collapsed as his arms came free. Mitchell caught him before he hit the floor. "You all right?" Jenkins gave a weak shrug. "I've had worse days." Carter checked the doorway. "We need to move." Mitchell helped Jenkins to his feet. The sergeant leaned heavily against him. "You find the camp then?" Jenkins asked quietly. Mitchell nodded. "You were right." Jenkins managed a faint smile. Mitchell supported him as they moved toward the door. Conversation could wait. Right now, they were all dead men walking if they didn't get out soon. Their only chance of surviving the night was leaving before anyone realized they were there. Back across the compound waited the prisoners. And beyond the fence waited the jungle. The hard part was only beginning. Chapter 17. The Break. Mitchell tightened his grip around Jenkins as they stepped out of the interrogation building. The humid Cambodian night wrapped around them again, thick and heavy with the smell of wet earth, rotting vegetation, and damp wood. Jenkins leaned heavily against Mitchell's shoulder, his legs weak and unsteady after what appeared to be hours of interrogation. Carter moved ahead of them, scanning the compound yard with quick, controlled movements. The lantern outside the interrogation building flickered softly in the warm night air. For the moment, no one had noticed the missing guard. "Easy," Mitchell whispered. Jenkins let out a slow, strained breath. "You always did have terrible timing, Mitchell." Mitchell almost smiled. "Good to see you too. Glad I could again come and get you out of a tough spot." Carter motioned toward the shadowed wall of the main barracks. "Move." The three men crossed the clearing quickly, staying low and close to the building where the lantern light couldn't reach them. Carter reached the barracks wall first and pressed himself flat against the rough boards. He looked back just in time to see Mitchell struggling to guide Jenkins across the open ground. Carter understood the situation immediately. This was a losing equation. Only a matter of time before a guard looked in the wrong direction and ended the mission. From the watchtower above, a guard shifted slightly, but never glanced downward. Mitchell could feel his pulse hammering in his chest. If even one guard turned his head at the wrong moment, the entire camp would erupt into gunfire. They reached the rear corner of the barracks. Carter leaned carefully around the edge. Gate guard still there. Mitchell looked toward the prisoner building. The door stood partially open. Reyes waited just inside the darkness. Good. They hadn't been discovered yet. Almost there, Mitchell whispered. Jenkins lifted his head slightly. "You get the others?" "6 prisoners," Mitchell said quietly. "One of them's Danny." Jenkins stopped walking. "What?" Mitchell nodded. "Danny Johnston." For a moment, Jenkins stared at him as if he had misheard. "Thought he died. So did I." Jenkins shook his head slowly. "War's not done surprising us," Carter signaled again. Later, they crossed the remaining stretch of ground and slipped inside the prisoner building. Reyes turned immediately. "Took you long enough." Then he saw Jenkins. His eyes widened slightly. "Well, I'll be damned." Jenkins managed a tired grin. "Still ugly as ever, Reyes." Reyes chuckled quietly. "Good to see you alive." Inside the building, the 6 prisoners had already begun preparing to move. Whitaker had slipped inside during Carter and Mitchell's absence, and now knelt beside one of the weaker prisoners, checking his pulse beneath the dim lantern light. "How bad?" Carter asked. Whitaker glanced up. "They're weak but stable. If we move slow, they can walk." Danny stood near the wall watching Mitchell and Jenkins carefully. When his eyes finally settled on Jenkins, he stepped forward. "You made it." Jenkins looked surprised. "You're Danny." Danny nodded, still breathing. Jenkins chuckled softly. "Mitchell always did bring good luck." Mitchell shook his head. "Let's not test that theory." Carter raised his hand slightly. "Everyone listen." The room fell silent. "We move now," Carter continued quietly. "Same way we came in, fence gap near the tree line." Whitaker helped one of the prisoners stand. "How far once we're outside?" "Couple miles before we stop," Carter said. "Need distance before sunrise." Reyes checked his rifle. "And if the guards notice?" Carter answered calmly. "Then we cover and move. There's a stream about 500 yards from here, east. We meet there and set up a hasty defense pointing back toward the cut wire. Once we're clear, we move out." Danny stepped closer to Mitchell. "You sure they won't catch us?" Mitchell looked at him. "We didn't come this far to fail." Danny nodded slowly. "Fair enough." Carter moved to the doorway and listened carefully. The compound outside remained quiet. The guard near the gate still smoked his cigarette. The tower guard leaned lazily against the rail. "No alarms, no shouting." "Let's go," Carter whispered. The prisoners moved carefully toward the door. Mitchell and Reyes stepped outside first, scanning the clearing. The lantern still burned beside the building. Long shadows stretched across the packed dirt. Carter guided the prisoners into the darkness along the wall. Whitaker stayed close beside the weakest man, supporting most of his weight as they moved. Mitchell glanced briefly toward the interrogation building. The guard they had taken down remained hidden behind the structure. "Still no sign anyone had noticed." "Keep moving," Carter whispered. They crossed the clearing slowly. Every step felt like walking across a minefield. Mitchell watched the guards carefully. The man at the gate finished his cigarette and flicked the glowing butt into the dirt. For one terrifying moment, he turned in their direction. Mitchell froze. The guard stretched his arms lazily and turned back toward the gate. Mitchell exhaled slowly. They reached the fence. The small opening Carter had cut earlier remained hidden beneath the drooping strands of barbed wire. Reyes slipped through first and took position outside. Whitaker helped the first prisoner crawl beneath the wire. One by one, the men squeezed through the narrow gap. Danny followed, moving slowly but with determination. Jenkins waited beside Mitchell until the others had cleared the fence. "You first," Jenkins whispered. Mitchell shook his head. "After you." Jenkins didn't have the strength. Mitchell and Carter pushed and guided him through the wire. Once on the other side, he disappeared into the jungle shadows with Whitaker. Mitchell followed. The moment his boots touched the jungle floor outside the compound, the tight knot in his chest loosened slightly. They had made it out, but the danger was far from over. Sooner or later, the missing guard would be discovered. Then the hunt would begin. Carter crouched beside the group. Reyes, point. Reyes nodded and moved ahead into the jungle. Whitaker quickly checked the prisoners. All present, Mitchell counted. 6 prisoners. Danny, Jenkins, everyone. Carter raised his hand. Move. The group slipped into the jungle. Behind them, the prison camp remained quiet, unaware that its prisoners had vanished into the darkness. Mitchell walked beside Danny as they pushed through the undergrowth. You holding up? Danny gave a tired smile. Better than yesterday. Mitchell glanced back once toward the compound. The lantern still flickered faintly in the distance through the trees. Soon the guards would discover the empty building. Then the jungle would erupt with search parties. Mitchell knew they needed distance. But for the first time since entering Cambodia, he allowed himself a small measure of relief. They had done the impossible. They had found the prisoners. They had found Danny. And they had brought Jenkins out alive. Now they just had to survive the jungle long enough to get them home. Chapter 18. The Sound of Morning. Within seconds, the vegetation hid every trace they had passed through. Within minutes, the prison compound had vanished to a dense wall of trees. Behind them, a shout suddenly echoed through the trees. More voices followed. A whistle shrieked somewhere inside the camp. Whitaker didn't slow down. Move, he whispered sharply. Branches snapped as the team pushed deeper into the jungle. Mitchell glanced back once. Through the trees, he could see lanterns moving. The camp had finally realized the prisoners were gone. Mitchell moved near the center of the group, keeping pace beside Daniel Johnston and Sergeant Thomas Jenkins. Major Carter led from the front while Sergeant Reyes moved several yards ahead on point. Doc Whitaker stayed near the rear with the weakest of the prisoners. The jungle floor was wet and uneven beneath their boots. Roots twisted through the earth like hidden traps waiting to catch tired feet. For the rescued prisoners, every step was a struggle. They were barefoot, but years without shoes had left their feet calloused enough to endure rough ground that would have torn softer skin apart. Mitchell watched Danny carefully. You doing all right? Danny nodded, breathing hard but steady. Weeks of captivity had hollowed him out, but adrenaline now burned through his veins. Every instinct told him his body should have failed him long ago. Yet the desperate need to stay alive pushed him forward step after step. Mitchell glanced toward Jenkins. The sergeant leaned slightly to one side as he walked, favoring the damage done to him, but he refused to slow down. They treat you rough in there? Mitchell asked quietly. Jenkins gave a faint smirk. They tried. Mitchell studied the bruises across Jenkins' face. Looks like they got a few good swings in. Jenkins shrugged. Nothing I didn't deserve. Danny chuckled softly. Still the same stubborn bastard. Mitchell felt a strange sense of calm walking between them. Just hours earlier, he had believed both men were gone. Danny lost to the jungle during that firefight. Jenkins vanished chasing the truth. Now both of them walked beside him in the darkness. For a moment, it almost felt like Vietnam again. Except now they were the ones being hunted. Ahead, Carter suddenly raised his fist. The entire group froze instantly. Reyes crouched low near a fallen tree, scanning the jungle ahead. Mitchell listened. At first, he heard nothing except insects and the faint rustle of leaves. Then it came, a distant mechanical sound drifting through the trees. Helicopters, far away but getting closer. Reyes turned his head slightly. Not ours. Carter nodded. Danny whispered quietly. How long before they are on our heels? Carter answered calmly. Depends how fast they move. Jenkins glanced upward through the canopy. They'll use dogs. Mitchell knew he was right. Tracking teams would be the real danger. The jungle might conceal them from helicopters. It would not hide them from trained dogs. Carter studied the terrain ahead. We need water. Reyes nodded. River should be east about a mile. Carter turned toward the group. We changed direction. Mitchell reached out to steady one of the weaker prisoners. Stay close. The group began moving again, angling toward the distant river. The jungle grew thicker as they pushed toward the sound of water. Branches bent low over the narrow route. Vines clawed at their sleeves, and thorns scraped at their uniforms as if the jungle itself wanted to slow them down. The air hung heavy and wet, pressing against every breath. Several times the prisoners stumbled. Whitaker quietly kept them moving. Mitchell noticed Danny beginning to lag. You sure you're all right? Danny wiped sweat from his brow. Been a long time since I ran anywhere. Mitchell smiled faintly. Just like old times. Danny looked over at him. Except now we're older. Mitchell didn't argue. Ahead, the sound of moving water grew louder. Reyes raised his hand again. River. The group reached the narrow jungle stream a few minutes later. The water slid slowly between moss-covered stones and dark mud banks hidden beneath low-hanging roots. Carter stepped into the shallow current without hesitation. Everyone in. The prisoners followed carefully. Cool water soaked through boots and clothing immediately. Mitchell helped Danny across the slick stones while Whitaker guided the others into the stream. Once everyone stood ankle-deep in the moving water, Carter spoke quietly. "We move in the river for a while," breaks the scent. Jenkins nodded in approval. The group began walking downstream. Water splashed softly around their legs. The current washed away footprints and scattered scent. Mitchell could hear the helicopters more clearly now. The distant chop of rotors rolled through the jungle. Searchlights might already be sweeping the area near the camp. Danny looked toward the sky. "They're coming." Mitchell nodded. "Let them." Danny gave him a curious look. "You sound confident." Mitchell shrugged slightly. "We're still alive." Behind them, Whitaker whispered to Carter. "One of the prisoners is fading." Carter slowed the pace. Mitchell turned back. The older prisoner who had spoken earlier inside the building now leaned heavily against Whitaker, his body trembling with weakness. His breathing had become shallow. Whitaker lowered him carefully onto a rock beside the stream. "Easy." Mitchell crouched beside them. "How bad?" Whitaker examined the man quickly. "Malnutrition, exhaustion, years of it." The prisoner opened his eyes slowly. "You can't stop for me." Mitchell shook his head. "We're not leaving anyone." The man looked toward Danny. "You said America was coming." Danny nodded. "They did." The prisoner managed a faint smile. "Then I held on long enough." Whitaker pressed a canteen to the man's lips. "Drink." The man swallowed weakly. After a moment, he nodded. "I can walk." Carter glanced upward again. The sound of helicopters had grown louder. "We don't have much time." Mitchell helped the man back to his feet. "Lean on me." The group continued down the stream. The water carried them farther from the prison compound, farther from the guards who would soon be pushing into the jungle behind them. But Mitchell knew the hardest part of the mission was only beginning. They still had miles to go. Weak prisoners, enemy patrols, helicopters overhead, and a jungle that could kill a man just as easily as any soldier. Mitchell glanced at Danny as they moved. "Still think you died back there?" Danny smiled wearily. "Starting to think I got a second chance." Mitchell nodded slowly. "Let's make sure we don't waste it." The river slowed them. Water reached halfway up Mitchell's calves now, the current tugging steadily at their legs as the group moved downstream through the dark jungle corridor. Major Carter kept the pace controlled. Moving too fast would exhaust the prisoners. Moving too slow would let the enemy close the gap. Above the thick canopy, the helicopters continued circling. The sound rolled through the jungle like distant thunder. Mitchell could hear them clearly now. "They're spreading out," Jenkins said quietly beside him. Mitchell glanced over. "How can you tell?" Jenkins tilted his head slightly. "Listen." Mitchell focused. The rotor sounds shifted. Two separate aircraft now moving apart. Search patterns. "They're sweeping," Jenkins said. Mitchell nodded slowly. "They'll start pushing ground teams soon." Ahead, Reyes moved carefully through the water, checking both banks every few steps. "I've been in a cage," Danny muttered quietly. "First night free and we're running through a river." Mitchell smirked. "Would you rather go back?" Danny shook his head immediately. "Not a chance." The older prisoner, who had nearly collapsed earlier, leaned heavily against Whitaker but kept moving. Mitchell admired the resolve in the man's face. Years of suffering had not broken him. Suddenly, Reyes raised his fist. The column froze again. Carter moved forward slowly. "What is it?" Reyes pointed toward the muddy riverbank. Mitchell moved closer. "Tracks, fresh ones. Boot prints pressed into the soft earth where someone had crossed the stream." Reyes shook his head. "Too fresh." Jenkins crouched beside the tracks. "Patrol." Mitchell felt his stomach tighten. Carter looked up. "How many?" Jenkins studied the impressions again. 3, maybe 4. Reyes scanned the jungle ahead. They crossed heading west. Carter considered their options. If we stay in the river, they'll lose the scent. Mitchell nodded. But if they sweep wide, they might run straight into us. Carter looked back toward the prisoners. They were tired, slow. If a patrol spotted them in open jungle, they would have no chance. Jenkins stood. "We should leave the river soon." Mitchell frowned. "That defeats the point." Jenkins nodded. "But patrols will check water crossings first." Carter understood immediately. "They'll assume we tried this trick." Reyes pointed toward a narrow rise on the eastern bank. "Terrain gets rough that way, harder for patrols to move." Carter made the decision quickly. "All right, we cut east." Mitchell turned to Danny. "You ready?" Danny nodded. "Let's do it." One by one, the group climbed out of the river and back into the dense jungle. Mud clung heavily to their boots as they moved uphill through tangled vines and low branches. The ground here was steeper. Loose earth and slick roots made every step uncertain. Anyone within earshot would have thought a drunken platoon was trying to force its way through the jungle, but the terrain got even rougher higher up. Exactly what Carter wanted. Hard ground slowed everyone, but it slowed enemy patrols too. Mitchell stayed near the middle of the formation, keeping the prisoners moving. Whitaker whispered quietly to the older man again. "Almost there." "Where?" the man asked weakly. Whitaker smiled faintly. "Anywhere but that camp." Danny glanced back toward Mitchell. "You ever notice something strange?" "What's that?" "The jungle sounds different tonight." Mitchell listened. Danny was right. The usual chorus of insects and night birds had grown quieter. Animals sensed disturbance before men did. Helicopters, patrols, too much movement. The jungle knew something was wrong. Ahead, Reyes suddenly dropped low. Carter immediately crouched. Mitchell followed. Through the trees, he saw faint movement in the distance. Flashlights. 3 beams sweeping slowly through the jungle. Enemy patrol. Carter leaned toward Jenkins. "Same group?" Jenkins watched the lights carefully. "Could be," Reyes whispered. "They're moving north." Mitchell studied their direction. "They're cutting between the river and the ridge, trying to box them in." Carter signaled silently. Everyone down. The patrol moved closer. Quiet voices drifted through the jungle. Mitchell tightened his grip around his rifle. He refused to assume the terrain would protect them. If they were discovered, the fight would be short and violent, and the prisoners would never outrun the reinforcements that followed. Danny crouched beside him. "Think they see us?" Mitchell shook his head. "Not yet." The flashlight beams moved slowly across the trees. For one terrible moment, a beam swept dangerously close to their position. Whitaker gently pushed one of the prisoners lower into the brush. Mitchell held his breath. The beam paused, then moved on. Minutes dragged by. Finally, the patrol continued north through the jungle. The flashlight beams faded into darkness. Only when the voices disappeared completely did Carter signal the group to move again. "That was close," Danny whispered. Mitchell nodded. "Too close." Jenkins looked back toward the direction the patrol had gone. "They're tightening the net," Reyes spoke quietly. "We need distance before sunrise," Carter agreed. "We keep moving." Mitchell helped the older prisoner step over a fallen tree. "How far to extraction?" Danny asked quietly. Carter answered without turning. "Several miles." Danny sighed. "Guess I picked the wrong night to get rescued." Mitchell chuckled softly. Same old Danny, even after everything he had been through. They kept moving deeper into the jungle. Behind them, the prison compound had already sent men into the forest. Tracking teams. Dogs. Faint barking carried through the distance now, enough to keep every man moving. Mitchell knew this was no longer just an escape. It had become a hunt, and the enemy had numbers on their side. But Mitchell also knew something those patrols did not. The men they were chasing had already survived Vietnam, and soldiers who had survived that war were not easy prey. Mitchell looked once more toward Danny and Jenkins walking beside him. "Stay sharp," he whispered. The jungle ahead remained dark and watchful, and somewhere inside that darkness, the hunt had already begun. Chapter 19. The Dogs. Dawn came slowly in the jungle. A faint gray light filtered through the layers of tangled branches, turning the darkness into shadowed shapes and outlines. The air had grown cooler, but the humidity still clung to the skin like wet cloth. Mitchell stayed quietly beside Danny as the group pushed deeper through the Cambodian jungle. Major Carter kept the pace steady, though the exhaustion among the rescued prisoners was becoming more obvious with every mile. They had been moving about 4 hours now. Now daylight threatened to expose them. Sergeant Reyes raised his hand again from point position. The column stopped instantly. Mitchell listened. At first he heard only the steady buzz of insects and the distant creaking of tree branches in the morning wind. Then something else, a faint barking sound, far away, but unmistakable. Dogs, still searching. Jenkins heard it too. He turned his head slowly. "There they are." Danny looked confused. "Dogs?" Jenkins nodded grimly. The river had helped, but not enough. Eventually, the scent trail would return. Carter moved closer to the front. "How far?" Reyes listened carefully. "Maybe 2 miles. Whitaker spoke quietly behind them. "They'll close that distance fast." Mitchell knew he was right. Tracking dogs moved faster than tired men. Danny glanced toward the rising daylight. "Then we better move faster." Carter shook his head. "If we push too hard, we'll collapse before they reach us." Jenkins studied the terrain around them. "We need something that slows them." Mitchell thought quickly. The jungle around them was dense but uneven. Steep slopes, rocky outcroppings, dry gullies cutting through the trees. Then he saw it, a narrow ridge ahead. The slope on both sides dropped sharply into thick jungle below. "Up there," Mitchell said quietly. Carter followed his gaze. "High ground." Jenkins nodded slowly. "And wind." Mitchell understood. Scent traveled differently along ridges. Sometimes it scattered. Sometimes it vanished entirely. Carter raised his hand. "We move up." The climb was slow and painful. The prisoners struggled with every step up the steep slope. Whitaker stayed beside the weakest men, encouraging them quietly. Mitchell helped Danny climb over a cluster of exposed rocks. "You still with me?" Danny gave a tired grin. They reached the ridge after nearly 20 minutes of climbing. The ground leveled out slightly along the top. Wind moved gently through the trees here. Mitchell felt it brushing across his face. Behind them, the sound of the dogs had grown louder. Reyes crouched near the edge of the ridge and looked down. "They're getting closer." Jenkins moved beside him. "How many?" "2 dogs," Reyes said. "Maybe 3 handlers." Carter scanned the terrain. "If they reach the base of the ridge, they'll follow us up." Mitchell nodded. "Unless we confuse the scent." Jenkins looked at him. "You got an idea?" Mitchell glanced at the prisoners. "We split the trail." Carter frowned slightly. "Explain." Mitchell pointed along the ridge. "The wind's moving west." Jenkins understood immediately. 2 scent trails. Mitchell nodded. "One group keeps moving along the ridge." "And the other?" Carter asked. Mitchell looked toward a steep slope leading down the eastern side. "Drops off the ridge and circles back." Danny shook his head slowly. "You want to trick the dogs." Jenkins smiled faintly. Carter considered the plan quickly. "Too risky." Mitchell nodded. "Exactly, but we have to do something. Otherwise, we're going to be fighting it out." He looked at Danny. "You and me." Danny raised an eyebrow. "You sure you want to volunteer for that?" Mitchell shrugged. "You move better than the other prisoners." Danny chuckled. "Barely." Carter studied both men carefully. 10 minutes. Mitchell looked confused. "For what?" "For you two to break their trail." Reyes glanced down the ridge again. "They're almost at the bottom." Danny stepped forward suddenly. Mitchell looked into his friend's eyes. "You just got free." Danny nodded. "Exactly. Looks like you've got company." Carter didn't argue. 3 minutes, he said. "Then we move." Mitchell stepped closer to Danny. "You sure?" Danny smiled tiredly. "Always wanted one more jungle run." Mitchell couldn't help but laugh. "All right." Danny checked the slope on the eastern side. "That way." Reyes turned back toward Carter. "What about us?" Carter looked at the prisoners. "We keep moving west along the ridge." Whitaker helped the older prisoner steady himself. "Just keep walking." The barking below had grown louder now. The dogs were close, too close. Carter looked at Mitchell one last time. 10 minutes. Mitchell nodded. "That's all we need." He turned toward the slope with Danny. The 2 men began descending quickly into the dense jungle below. Branches snapped quietly beneath their boots as they moved. The plan was simple. Confuse the dogs, split the trail, give the prisoners enough time to escape. Mitchell glanced back once toward the ridge. Carter and the others were already moving away. Good. They needed distance. Danny wiped sweat from his brow. "You realize this is the stupidest plan we've had yet," Danny chuckled. "Feels like old times." Mitchell listened to the barking behind them. The dogs were almost at the ridge now. "Let's give them something to chase." The men disappeared into the jungle, and the hunt changed direction. Chapter 20. The Trap. The jungle closed tightly around them as Mitchell and Danny pushed deeper down the eastern slope. Branches snapped beneath their boots. Vines scraped against their uniforms. Thick undergrowth clawed at their legs as they moved fast through the darkness. Behind them, the barking of the tracking dogs grew louder. Much louder. Danny glanced over his shoulder. They took the bait. Mitchell didn't slow. Good. Danny wiped sweat from his face with the back of his hand. "Remind me again why we volunteered for this part?" Mitchell allowed himself the faintest smirk. "Because we're the only idiots who know how to survive this jungle." Danny let out a quiet breath that almost passed for a laugh. "Fair point." They kept moving downhill through a dense patch of bamboo, the narrow stalks knocking softly against one another as they passed. Mitchell kept his pace controlled, leaving a clear scent trail for the dogs to follow. That was the point. Pull the hunters away from Carter and the prisoners. Buy them time. But the plan had a second part. Mitchell stopped suddenly. This is it. And Danny looked around. The terrain had changed. A narrow ravine cut through the jungle ahead of them, its steep sides lined with brush, roots, and exposed rock. It was a natural choke point, tight and uneven, the kind of ground that forced men to move where the land told them to move. The perfect place. Danny nodded slowly. You thinking what I'm thinking? Mitchell crouched and studied the ground. If they follow the trail, they'll come straight through here. Danny looked uneasy. And then what? Mitchell looked up at him. We disappear. Mitchell reached down, pulled the .22 pistol from his holster, and handed it to Danny. Danny understood immediately. He grinned. I like this plan. The barking was close now. The dogs had reached the base of the ridge. Mitchell moved quickly along the edge of the ravine, snapping branches and kicking loose dirt to strengthen the trail. Then he pointed toward a cluster of thick vines wrapped around a large tree beside the cut in the ground. Up there. Danny nodded. When did you get good at being point? Mitchell gave him a brief smile. Lot we need to talk about, I guess. Without hesitation, the two men climbed quickly into the dense branches. The foliage swallowed them almost completely, turning them into shadows inside shadows. From below, the tree looked like nothing more than another tangle of jungle growth. Mitchell settled himself on a thick branch and pulled his rifle close. Stay still, he whispered. Danny positioned himself carefully beside him. Hearts beating like a drum. Mitchell kept his eyes on the ravine below. Welcome back to the jungle. Minutes passed. The barking grew louder, closer. Then shapes appeared through the trees. 3 soldiers forcing their way through the brush. 2 handlers with rifles. 2 tracking dogs straining hard at their leashes. Mitchell held his breath. The patrol followed the scent trail directly toward the ravine. One of the handlers crouched near the disturbed dirt Mitchell had left behind. He pointed forward. The dogs barked eagerly and lunged toward the cut in the ground. Danny whispered, barely audible. They're taking it. Mitchell gave the smallest nod. The patrol entered the narrow ravine, exactly where Mitchell had wanted them. The steep walls forced them into a tight file. The dogs led the way, noses low, pulling hard against the leashes. Mitchell watched carefully. Wait. The first dog reached the center of the ravine and suddenly stopped. It sniffed the ground again, then lifted its head, confused. The trail ended there. The handler tugged on the leash. The dog barked again and began circling, unable to pick up the scent. Danny exhaled slowly. But the moment didn't hold. One of the soldiers looked up. Directly toward the tree, Mitchell felt his chest tighten. The soldier's eyes narrowed. In the same instant, Mitchell thumbed his selector from safe to semi and opened fire. The first handler dropped immediately. The second man, reacting too late, stumbled backward and fell into the ravine. The third soldier remained upright for a fraction of a second before Mitchell drove 3 quick rounds into his midsection. A short burp of fire turned toward the dogs, and then it was over. Mitchell rose slowly in the branches, knowing the man who had fallen into the ravine might still be alive. Silence settled hard over the jungle. No sound except Mitchell shifting forward for a better angle, making sure of what he had done. Then he took a half step and heard it. A snap below, and the sudden shout of the man on the ground. Mitchell moved in one motion. Another short volley erupted from his rifle. The voice cut off. Silence again. For several seconds, neither Mitchell nor Danny said anything. Mitchell already knew what came next. He climbed down first, rifle trained on the ravine and the bodies below in case any man or dog was still alive. Then he whispered softly, "Time to go." Danny climbed down after him. The 2 men quickly secured the AK-47 rifles and extra ammunition, then turned and moved fast back toward the ridge. Danny took point this time. How far from Carter? Mile, maybe, Mitchell said between breaths. They had barely started moving when gunfire cracked behind them. Both men dove for cover. Another round snapped through the jungle, then another. The meaning was immediate. One of them was still alive, and he was trying to signal the others. Danny had been preparing for this day for months. He watched Mitchell start to rise and move back down the slope toward the ravine, already understanding exactly what he meant to do. Danny reached out, grabbed Mitchell's leg, and stood beside him. "Let him call his buddies," Danny said. Mitchell looked at him. Danny's expression hardened as he looked back toward the ravine. "Let them find them and see what we will do if they come too." Chapter 21. The Extraction Ridge. The jungle opened without warning. One moment, Mitchell and Danny were forcing their way through vines and low branches. The next, the ground dropped away and the two men burst onto a narrow ridge of broken rock and knee-high grass overlooking a shallow valley. Mitchell stopped hard and dropped to one knee. "No cover," Danny said, breathing hard. Danny bent forward with his hands on his thighs, chest heaving. "Please tell me that's good news." Mitchell scanned the valley below. At the far end of the open space sat a small clearing cut into the jungle, barely wide enough for a helicopter to land. Fallen trees and charred stumps ringed the edges, signs it had been used before as a rough landing zone. Danny followed his gaze. Danny straightened and squinted down toward the clearing. "You think Carter made it there?" Before Mitchell could answer, a sharp burst of gunfire cracked through the jungle behind them. Bullets snapped over the ridge, kicking dirt and stone into the air. "Down!" Mitchell shouted. Both men dropped flat as another burst tore through the grass above them. Danny crawled toward a low rock outcropping near the ridge edge and fired a controlled burst back into the tree line. The enemy fire paused briefly, then resumed from a wider angle. "They're fanning out," Danny muttered. Mitchell peered over the ridge again. At first, he saw nothing but jungle shadow and the pale scar of the clearing. Then figures appeared along the far edge. Carter, Reyes, Whitaker, and the rescued prisoners moving into defensive positions around the landing zone. Relief hit Mitchell so suddenly it almost felt painful. "They made it," he said. Whitaker was helping the older prisoner Mitchell had supported in the river. Reyes knelt near a fallen stump, rifle trained toward the jungle perimeter. Carter stood in the center of the clearing with a radio handset pressed tightly to his ear, calling for extraction. Mitchell looked back toward the patrol closing on their ridge. "They're between us and the LZ." Danny nodded once. Then we punched through. Gunfire erupted again, this time from below. Carter's team had made contact with another enemy element near the landing zone. Mitchell swore quietly. "They're being boxed in." Danny looked from the ridge behind them to the clearing below. "You got any better ideas than running into the middle of it?" Mitchell checked his magazine. "No," Danny grinned. "Good. Would have worried me if you did." Another burst of fire stitched across the ridge. A tracking dog barked wildly somewhere just inside the tree line. Mitchell rose into a crouch. "Move on my signal. Straight down the slope. Keep firing. Don't stop." Danny gave him a tired, crooked smile. "Watch my 6. Mitchell met his eyes for only a second. Months of guilt and grief hung between them, but not now. Now there was only survival. Both men stood and fired quick bursts into the trees. "Go, go, go!" They charged down the ridge. Loose rock slid beneath their boots as they half ran, half fell toward the clearing below. Mitchell fired as he moved, aiming at muzzle flashes flickering in the jungle. Danny veered slightly left, drawing part of the enemy fire with him. From the clearing below, Reyes spotted them first. "Contact on the ridge!" he shouted. Carter turned, saw them, and understood instantly. He pointed toward the jungle behind Mitchell. "Suppress that line, bring them in." Reyes and Whitaker opened fire from the clearing, their rounds hammering the tree line and forcing the pursuing patrol to hesitate. Mitchell reached the bottom of the slope just as a helicopter rotor beat rolled across the valley. Everyone looked up. A Huey swept low over the treetops, skimming the canopy at impossible speed. A second helicopter followed behind it, door gunners already scanning the jungle edges. Danny laughed once, breathless and disbelieving. "That's the prettiest thing I've ever seen," he shouted. The first Huey banked sharply toward the clearing. Its rotor discs flashed in the sun as it dropped into the valley. 2 slicks followed behind. The extraction birds. Enemy fire erupted from the jungle to the east, tracer rounds slicing across the clearing. "RPG!" Reyes shouted. Mitchell turned just in time to see the flare of a rocket launch from the trees. The rocket streaked toward the lead helicopter. It missed wide, detonating against the far edge of the clearing in a violent spray of dirt and smoke. Mounted along the sides of the helicopters were stubby launch pods packed with 2.75-inch folding fin aerial rockets, the standard rocket system used by American helicopters throughout the war. Pilots called them FFARs. Most soldiers on the ground knew them by their nickname, Mighty Mice. Each rocket was roughly 3 feet long, a slender metal tube tipped with a high explosive warhead, and stabilized by fins that snapped open the moment it left the launcher. The rockets weren't guided. They didn't need to be. Fired in quick salvos, they blanketed a target area with enough explosive force to break up an ambush or tear apart a tree line. One of the gunships rolled slightly as the pilot lined up the attack run. Then the rockets fired. Bright flashes erupted from the pods and the rockets streaked away in tight clusters, leaving thin white trails slicing through the air. For a fraction of a second they seemed almost slow. Then they struck. The jungle erupted in a chain of violent explosions along the ridgeline where the enemy fire had come from moments earlier. Dirt blasted upward. Bamboo shattered. Branches splintered apart in violent bursts as the rockets slammed into the trees. The effect was immediate. Enemy fire collapsed into scattered bursts as the gunships roared overhead again. The Huey's turbine screaming as the pilot banked for another run. Gunships weren't heavily armored, but they were fast, maneuverable, and devastating in close support. Between the rocket pods and the door-mounted M60 machine guns, a pair of Hueys could deliver enough firepower in seconds to completely change the momentum of a fight. On the ground, the team didn't waste the opportunity. The rockets had done exactly what they were meant to do, break the ambush long enough for the helicopters behind them to land. Extraction had begun. The slicks dropped toward the clearing in a hurricane of wind and rotor noise, skids touching just long enough for the side doors to swing open. "Load them!" Carter shouted. Whitaker and Jenkins helped the weakest prisoners first, practically lifting them into the helicopter. Reyes covered the tree line with short, disciplined bursts. The second Huey circled overhead, its door gunner unleashing a deafening stream of fire that ripped branches apart along the eastern jungle edge. Mitchell grabbed Danny by the arm. "You're first." Danny yanked free. "Not a chance." "Danny." For a brief second, Mitchell saw the old Danny again. The man from before the firefight, before the jungle, before the names in the notebook. Jenkins shoved past them carrying a prisoner under one arm. More gunfire cracked across the clearing. One round slammed into the side of the Huey with a metallic clang. Another punched into the dirt inches from Carter's boot. "We're out of time!" Carter shouted. Mitchell turned and fired toward the muzzle flashes along the eastern tree line. The second Huey's gunner raked the same area, silencing it for the moment. "Move!" Carter ordered. Danny climbed into the helicopter first this time, immediately turning to pull another prisoner aboard. Jenkins followed, then Whitaker. Mitchell grabbed the older prisoner, and just as they stepped toward the helicopter, it happened. A perfectly placed round struck the man. The old prisoner went limp and collapsed to his knees. Mitchell fell beside him, trying to hold him upright, but the weight of the man and his rifle made it impossible. The prisoner fell forward onto the ground. Reyes, backing toward the helicopter while firing, stopped. He ran forward and unleashed a burst into the section of jungle where the shot had come from. Mitchell stared in disbelief. They had made it this far. How could it end like this? He didn't hesitate. He slung his rifle over his shoulder, lifted the wounded man, and carried him toward the Huey. Whitaker jumped down from the helicopter and helped drag the man inside so he could begin working. Mitchell turned back toward Reyes. Together, they continued firing while walking backward toward the aircraft. Reyes climbed in. Mitchell paused for one quick mental check. 6 prisoners. Danny, Jenkins, Whitaker, Reyes, Carter, himself. All here. Carter grabbed the metal frame of the open door and looked at him. "Get in!" Mitchell jumped, catching the edge of the door as the Huey began to lift. Strong hands hauled him inside. He landed hard on the floor, rolled, and looked back through the open door as the clearing dropped away beneath them. Below, enemy soldiers spilled into the landing zone seconds too late. The second Huey banked across their path and unleashed another burst from the door gun, forcing the soldiers back into the jungle. The valley fell away beneath them. The ridge disappeared. The prison camp, the dogs, the patrols, all swallowed by distance and jungle canopy. Inside the helicopter, no one spoke for several seconds. Men gasped for breath. Blood-streaked uniforms. Faces were hollow with exhaustion. Mitchell slowly pushing himself upright. Across from him, Danny stared through the chaos and rotor wash. Alive. Not a memory. Not a name in a notebook. Alive. Danny gave a faint, humorless smile. "Who are you?" Mitchell leaned back against the metal wall, breathing hard. But behind the relief, something else was already settling in. Questions. Who knew about the camp? How many others had been left behind? And what the army would do now that the dead were refusing to stay dead. Chapter 22. The Names We Leave Behind. The helicopter ride out of Cambodia felt longer than the flight in. Inside the Huey, the thunder of the rotor blades filled the cabin, swallowing most conversation before it could begin. Wind roared through the open side door, snapping loose straps and canvas against the metal walls, and carrying the sharp scent of aviation fuel through the cramped interior. No one complained. They were alive. That was enough. Whitaker had already confirmed what Mitchell had known the moment the man collapsed. The old prisoner had succumbed to the bullet. Mitchell sat on the floor with his back against the bulkhead, his rifle resting across his knees. The vibration of the aircraft hummed through the metal frame and into his spine. Jenkins sat beside him, one arm wrapped in a rough field bandage Doc Whitaker had tied during the flight. Whitaker moved methodically between the rescued prisoners, checking pulse and breathing again and again, as if he didn't quite trust the miracle that had just happened. Major Carter stood near the open door, one hand gripping the frame as he stared down at the endless stretch of jungle sliding past beneath them. Mitchell watched the landscape disappear. The prison compound was gone now, hidden again beneath miles of jungle and silence. But it was no longer invisible. Not to them. Danny opened his eyes and looked across the cabin toward Mitchell. Mitchell leaned his head back against the metal wall. "I thought you were dead." Danny gave a faint smile. "Apparently not." Jenkins chuckled quietly beside them. "War's funny like that." Mitchell reached slowly into his pocket. The notebook. He held it in his hand for a moment, staring down at the worn cover. Then he looked back toward Danny. Danny nodded toward it. "What you got there?" Mitchell didn't answer. Instead, his gaze drifted toward the other rescued prisoners sitting along the cabin walls. 6 men who may have spent years in captivity. 6 men who had already been declared dead somewhere in a report or on a list. 6 names that had likely already been written down. Whitaker crouched beside the older prisoner, documenting quietly on a medic card. Carter turned away from the open door and stepped toward Mitchell. "We'll reach Thailand in about 40 minutes. Mitchell nodded once. "And then?" Carter shrugged slightly. "Debrief, medical checks, a lot of questions." Jenkins spoke quietly. Questions they might not want answers to. Carter didn't disagree. The helicopter banked slightly as it crossed the border. Below them, the jungle slowly thinned into patches of farmland and scattered dirt roads. Civilization. Mitchell suddenly realized how strange it felt to see it again. Danny noticed the shift in his expression. "You okay?" Mitchell nodded slowly. "Just thinking." "About what?" Mitchell looked down at the notebook in his hand. "About names." Danny tilted his head slightly. "What about them?" Mitchell opened the notebook. The same worn notebook he had carried since Vietnam. The pages were filled with names. Men who had died. Men who had disappeared. Men who had never come home. He flipped slowly through the pages. Finally, he stopped. Danny leaned forward. On the page was a single name written in faded ink. Daniel Johnston. Danny stared at it quietly for several seconds. Mitchell took a slow breath, looking at the name written on the page. For months he had turned to that page. Again and again, believing his friend was dead. Now he understood something different. It wasn't just a record of men who were dead or missing. It was a record of the forgotten. The names left behind. Mitchell pulled a pen from his pocket. Slowly, carefully, he drew a single line through the name. Daniel Johnston. Not erased, not removed, just crossed out. Danny watched in silence. "What about the others?" he asked. Mitchell looked down at the remaining names on the page. Men who had vanished during the war. Men whose bodies had never been found. Men who might still be out there somewhere. He closed the notebook slowly. "That's a problem," Mitchell said. Jenkins leaned forward slightly. "What problem?" Mitchell looked up. "How many more names are wrong?" The helicopter cabin grew quiet. Even the roar of the rotors seemed distant for a moment. Carter folded his arms. "You think there are more camps?" Mitchell nodded. "We just proved there was at least one." Jenkins rubbed his bruised jaw thoughtfully. "I saw other prisoners moved through that place," he said quietly. "Not many, but some." Whitaker looked up from where he knelt beside the prisoners. "You're saying there could be more Americans still out there?" Danny stared out toward the jungle fading behind them. "Wouldn't surprise me." Carter glanced toward the cockpit. "This operation never happened." Mitchell knew exactly what he meant. Officially, the war was over. Officially, there were no more prisoners. Officially, every name had already been accounted for. Mitchell opened the notebook again and looked down at the remaining names. Names written in the same careful handwriting. Names that might still belong to living men. He closed the book and slipped it back into his pocket. The helicopter began descending. Below them, the lights of the covert base in Thailand appeared through the evening haze. Danny looked across the cabin toward Mitchell. "So, what happens now?" Mitchell watched the base growing closer beneath them. The war was ending. But something told him the story wasn't finished. "Now," Mitchell said quietly, "we start asking questions." Jenkins smiled faintly. "I was hoping you'd say that." The Huey settled onto the landing pad in a storm of dust and rotor wash. Medics rushed forward. Soldiers moved quickly to help the prisoners off the aircraft. As Mitchell stepped down onto the ground, he glanced back once at the helicopter, at the jungle beyond it, at the war that refused to stay buried. In his pocket, the notebook felt heavier than it ever had before. And for the first time, Mitchell realized something that changed everything. The names he had written down weren't just haunting memories. They were unfinished stories. And somewhere out there were still names waiting to be found. You've been listening to The Names We Leave Behind. For Book 3, The Names We Find, click the link in the description. The American Military Outpost thanks you for listening. Follow the Mitchell family and their legacy of military service, a series ranging from America's birth through current conflicts in modern times.